Let Your Lives Begin Again. A Breath Without Life Novel, Book 5. Written by Janith Hooper. Narrated by Dannul Dailey. Copyright 2024. Dedication. This book is dedicated to Janith Hooper's youngest son, Benjamin John Hooper. He battled with the disease of alcoholism for many years before he even knew he had a problem, and then for years after, when he took on the fight in earnest. Alcoholism is a horrific disease, not to be taken lightly or swept under the rug. Too many are struggling and ultimately suffering from the physical effects of this disease, but almost more savage are the social and spiritual effects people endure. At the release of this book, Ben will be over 4 years sober. His testimony is laid out in the back of this book under author's note. You won't want to miss his victory story. To those struggling with this addiction, Jan and my heart go out to you. No matter how many times you have tried to stop and failed, there is hope. I pray this book brings you comfort and encouragement. To the family and friends of alcoholics, I pray this book helps you grasp the struggle and model one way to approach the disease, with open eyes and wisdom from above. Of the many scripture verses where God offers strength in times of trouble, one of my favorites is Isaiah 40:31, KJV. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. May you find your strength in the Lord, dear reader, that you also may mount on wings as eagles to overcome the challenges you and your loved ones face today. And to Jan's son Ben, the Hooper family are grateful beyond words to see you whole and healthy, by God's grace and your willingness to fight the good fight. To God be the glory. Chapter 1. Sacramento, San Joaquin River Delta, September 1962. Bronc Cooper glanced around the bar of his favorite restaurant in town. Al's place wasn't really designed for dancing, but tonight the bar was filled to the brim with gyrating bodies and ruckus laughter in honor of Marco, the bartender's birthday. The place was sure living it up to its Al the Wop's nickname. With 2 hours of beer guzzling already under his belt, Bronc was primed to join the others in blowing the lid off this place. He strode the perimeter, scanning the area for possible dance partners, other than the tired locals who pawed at him every night. No one caught his eye. Beer mug to mouth, he took long chugs as he continued his search. He managed 2 full circles around the dance floor when his eye caught a petite chick with straight blonde hair strolling in the front door, followed by an array of other snazzy women. Bronc took another big swig of his tankard, letting his eyes drift over the blonde as she removed her heavy coat and hung it on a hook by the door. A modest dress in pale blue with dark blue polka dots told him she wasn't the type to come here to carouse, as he was. She came from a different social class altogether, almost radiating purity and reverence, and most definitely innocence. He watched her make her way through the dense crowd, finally reaching a man who was behind the bar serving drinks. She smiled brightly, and Bronc's legs wobbled. Tilting up on tiptoes, she stretched across the bar top to plant a kiss on the grizzled old man's cheek. Bronc had never seen her here before, and here was where he spent most evenings. So, who was she, and why was she here? The man smiled back at her. She shouted something at him over the wild racket. He nodded in response. Wishing him a happy birthday, no doubt. A few seconds later, he handed her a glass with some dark soda pop in it. If Bronc had thought his chances with her slim before, her choice of drinks pretty much sealed the deal. She passed the pop to one of her friends. This continued until all 6 of them had drinks in hand and had all greeted the birthday boy. The jukebox vibrated to a stop for only a few seconds until "Let's Twist Again" by Chubby Checkers blared out and everyone on the dance floor began to swivel and whoop. Bronc observed the girls as they wiggled to the beat on their way around the crowd toward a table in the back. Never one to let even slim possibilities get away without at least trying, he aimed to circle the other way to meet them when they arrived. He swayed a little and he turned too fast. Catching himself, he steadied, then concentrated on his heel-toe stride until he soon stood over the table they'd chosen. He smiled, confident. His Cooper good looks usually brought him a score, especially when his charming brother was with him. A twinge hit his chest. How he missed Brand. But he pushed it aside. Tonight would be a little tougher, but when he drank, his own brand of charm came alive. Pun intended. He laughed out loud at his own joke. A small inkling of dread tried to dampen his spirits. This girl wasn't the typical local yokel. She was different, sort of unworldly. He shouldn't taint her. But he hadn't listened to his conscience in a long time, not since he'd put aside any hope of becoming the man his dad wanted him to be. Polka Dot was smiling and pointing up at the ceiling, a full explanation in gear to the other girls. Al the Wops was known for its ceiling of dollar bills, all stuck permanently to the beams with thumbtacks. Anyone visiting the establishment gave it their best shot. Bronc figured there were hundreds of dollars worth of other people's money up there. Competition was frequent. Some bills stuck, some didn't. His always stuck. He'd gotten so good at pressing the thumbtack through the bill, backing it with a silver dollar, and flipping it to the ceiling, that he'd earned himself a reputation and many a reward. One was a discount off the only meal the restaurant served: steak with toasted French bread slathered with peanut butter and jam. Odd for sure, but unique enough it brought people from all over the state for the unusual feast. The other was his particular favorite, a drink on the house. One girl peeled her eyes away from Polka Dot to look up at Bronc, standing tall over the group. Then another. Soon the whole group was oogling him. All were smiling except for their leader. Her tentative smile hinted at her attraction to him, but her eyes were steady and skeptical. As well they should be. Part of him cheered her on. "Good evening, ladies," Bronc crooned, then took another gulp of his brew. He licked his lips, then purposefully gave them one of the heart-stopping smiles Coopers were known for. 2 of the girls widened their eyes, while 3 others grinned back. One frowned. Little Polka Dot. "Would you like a demonstration?" He glanced up at the ceiling, then back to the ladies. "Oh, yes, of course, sure thing." All but one had an affirmative answer. Bronc took out his trusty silver dollar, pulled a bare thumbtack from a post next to him, and looked to them. "Anyone got a dollar they'd like to lose?" He grinned again, but he grimaced when he saw Polka Dot's grim face. He ignored it. Reaching out, he grasped a bill from one of the ladies. He didn't let his snatching the bill prick his conscience, what little there was of it. Bronc waited until all eyes were on him, and with a smirk of confidence, he poked the tack through the bill, centered the silver dollar beneath it, and gave it a hearty fling toward the ceiling. Most of the dancers had stopped to watch, though the song droned on. His offering hit a rustic board with a thwack, and they all watched with anticipation until only the silver dollar fell back. Bronc caught it, stuffed it in his pocket, and winked at the group while those around him applauded. Mouths were agape, even Polka Dot's. "Wow, that was impressive. Can you do that every time?" Bronc pulled his lip up on one side in a half-smile, then told them the truth. "Nope, not always." Polka Dot seemed to like that answer. Because he told the truth or because she wanted him to be a loser. He frowned, figuring the latter. Most people thought of him that way. Why not her? Irritated now, he knew he had to distract himself before he gave her a piece of his mind. "Dance?" Bronc asked the group. She dropped her eyes to her drink, while the scraping of chairs and exuberant me from the other 5 was what he expected. A cute, curly-haired brunette with dimples and a tiny waist grabbed hold of his arm, so she won the spot. He plunked his beer on their table and gripped her hand. He swung her out to the crowd where they joined the other twisting bodies. Bronc didn't like dancing much, especially not the twist, but always seemed to manage it just fine when he had too much to drink. He felt the flush of alcohol to his face, but ignored it, and the unsteadiness in his legs as he proceeded to make Chubby Checker proud. Minutes clicked by when he finally leaned in close to his dance partner's ear. "What's your name?" "Karen, what's yours?" "Bronc." As soon as he'd said his name, he gestured back toward the table. He was done, spending every day on the farm helping his grandfather. Then drinking throughout the evening had begun to weaken his body in ways he'd never experienced before. Part of him worried he was killing himself gradually, while the other part rejoiced in that possibility. At least his choice of destruction was fun. Being the youngest of 6 sons and the target of his dad's constant badgering had grown old. Karen's face fell, but she nodded and traipsed over to the table where the other girls were watching them. "My turn! My turn!" another brunette hollered over the noise. The others were bouncing in their seats as well, except, you guessed it, Polka Dot. She was watching him, though. He knew the attraction was there, but something was holding her back. Bronc grabbed a chair from another table and turned it backwards to straddle. He snatched up his beer and gave them a weak grin. "Sorry, ladies. Tired." He took a long swallow, then swiped his forearm across his mouth. Polka Dot's face distorted in a look of disapproval. He ignored it and scanned the group. "You a college bunch?" They all looked over school age, really, but most of them still acted young. "Nope, church," one of the quieter ones said. "Julia's our Bible study leader." Bronc stiffened. "Church? Why would they come to a bar?" "Oh, that's right, the birthday party." "You know Marco then, huh?" His lips had begun to chap, making each word harder to form. Soon he'd be slurring if he didn't pay close attention. Another beer would help, and maybe it was time to add whiskey shots to it. "Yep, he's Julia's great-uncle." This from another gal with a beehive hairdo. Bronc's eyes followed hers to Polka Dot. "So, you must be Julia." He rubbed his palm against his jeans, then reached out to shake her hand. "Bronc Cooper, Wyoming born and raised." Julia peered down at the offer, then up at him with blue eyes that resembled a cloudless Wyoming sky. Her expression showed disapproval of his drunken state. He was used to that, but it also showed pity. He hated pity. The familiar anger burned his gut, then rose to his mouth in the form of a sneer. Julia caught it, sucked down the rest of her soda through the straw, then stood. "Time to get you back." The others began to protest her decision, but it was obvious she was the one in charge. Slowly, one by one, the girls followed her lead, finishing off their sodas and rising to their feet. Dismissed. That had never happened to him before. Of course, Brand was usually with him to smooth things over, as if Bronc was utterly helpless on his own. He didn't need Brand, and he didn't need these girls. He came to his feet, furious, blurry-eyed, beer in hand, and caught his boot on the chair leg. The mug got away from him and jettisoned beer all over the back of a hulk of a man a few feet away on the dance floor,
What the?
The man whipped around and faced him. Usually the tallest in a room, Bronc straightened, using his size to intimidate. A wave of dizziness came over him.
You stupid drunk! You soaked me!
No one got away with talking to him that way. He plunked the remainder of his beer onto the table and lunged forward, drawing back his fist. An arm locked through his, stopping him cold. Bronc didn't know who it was, but a glance in the girl's direction showed 6 sets of wide eyes, all locked on the one who'd rescued the moment. He couldn't have that. Balling up his free hand, he let his left fist lead the way as he swung around. Brand Cooper drove his truck slowly along the winding riverbank, heading toward the town of Locke. Stiff and sore from driving 16 hours already that day, he had arrived at Harper Ranch West, his stepmother's family ranch outside of Cortland, in time for his very worried dad to send him out again in search of his wayward twin at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. The narrow river road widened a tad as he entered the small town, the sign boasting, Locke, population 80. This was it. If he blinked, he'd miss it. He turned left on the first road he came to, which took him down a small hill, then decided on an immediate right. By the looks of the buildings, this had to be their downtown area. Now to find a place called Al the Wops. He headed down Main Street. It was so narrow it was only 1 lane wide when cars were parked along the curbs. He cruised slowly through town, but saw the road was about to swoop back up to the river road. Not a small burg, more like a non-existent, he thought to himself with a chuckle. He glanced to the left, saw a hole-in-the-wall building with the sign sporting Al's Place. Yep, that had to be it. Backing his pickup into the only spot left open, he had to wonder where all these people had come from. Brand jumped out of the truck, jamming his cowboy hat on as he strode across the street toward a door shrouded by tattered boards. The sound of glasses clinking, excited voices, and loud music could be heard all the way out here. He opened the door, and a wave of humidity and laughter hit him in the face. The dance floor, what little there was of it, seemed to hold the whole crowd except for those crammed around the bar, drinking. The place was bigger than it looked from the outside. Brand's eyes were drawn to the ceiling, and a slew of dollar bills stuck to it. Crazy bunch. This was so not his scene. It was Bronc's, though. Brand enjoyed a quieter bar where he could drink and flirt and pick up willing women. But Bronc liked boisterous activity, heavy drinking, and fighting. Try as he might, he didn't know his way around women. He liked them well enough, but needed Brand's charm to keep them interested. As Brand scanned the crowd, he chuckled at how Bronc had probably already gotten himself in trouble with the womenfolk tonight, with his tactless truths and demanding personality. A loud shout came from his right. At a glance, he saw 2 tall cowboys standing nose to nose, one drilling down on the other in a loud enough voice to be heard over the latest Chubby Checker song. One looked like a lumberjack in a damp flannel red and black checkered shirt, while the other was puffing up for a fight. Bronc. Dread filled him. Brand muscled his way through the crowd, hoping he'd make it in time. When just as Bronc pulled his arm back to deliver what was sure to be a bone-crushing crack to the guy's face, Brand hooked him, bicep to bicep from behind. A glance to his left showed a group of young ladies with their mouths agape, staring at him. He was used to this. They both were. Often, identical twins grew up to look slightly different from one another. Not the case with the 2 of them. They'd both grown tall, muscled up the same, kept their dark hair trimmed identically, and went for similar clothes, often showing up with the same outfit without knowing the other had bought it. It still amazed him when he looked in the mirror and saw Bronc. There were only slight differences Bronc's hard lifestyle had created, like shadows under his eyes, and a lack of stamina due to choosing drink over nutrients. No wonder Dad was worried. His youngest son was killing himself slowly. Chapter 2. Time slowed as Brand watched the hot fury color Bronc's ears from behind. A roar spewed from Bronc's mouth as he swung around with his left fist leading. Brand was barely phased, knowing this dance well. Still holding strong to Bronc's right arm with his own, Brand took a giant step back, effectively twisting Bronc in a half circle, letting his own wild swing throw him off his feet. Inebriated as he was, he crashed directly to the floorboards, curse words filling the now dead air. Chubby Checker's song had ended, and the dancers had stopped to watch the show in silence. Nothing new to Brand. This was his life, protecting an errant twin while keeping his own head. It was getting old, but unless his brother found his way in life, it was Brand's fate. Drunk and fighting mad, Bronc straightened on the floor as best he could and yelled up at his offender. "You son of a—" He clamped his mouth shut, blinked. Deep lines intersected his brows as recognition hit. "Brand?" "You got it," Brand said in return, then grinned a greeting. "Good to see you, brother." "You're here?" Bronc said, his voice trailing off, his eyes filling with tears. If Brand wasn't mistaken, the dam was ready to break on his brother's emotions. Whether that was true or not, he had to distract him. Drinking always made him emotional. It was never pretty, and he couldn't let him embarrass himself. Brand stuck out his hand. Bronc clasped it. "Up you go." With a tug, and another hand on a shoulder to steady him, Bronc stood, swayed, then gaped at his brother, not quite believing his eyes. Brand didn't know if Bronc had come to one of these girls' rescue or had somehow ticked off the man he'd been ready to clobber. Either way, he had more work to do. He turned to the lumberjack, who was fuming, getting ready to clobber a defenseless Bronc. Brand interjected himself into his path. "Hello, my man," Brand said, sticking his hand out to shake the other man's hand.
"Who in Hades are you?"
The man glared, ignoring Brand's gesture. "I'm his Joan of Arc." He thrust a pointer finger behind him at Bronc, then dropped his smile and turned that same finger at the man. "And I'm your kryptonite." The man's face screwed up in total confusion.
"You're who? I'm what?"
"It means just go sit down. I'm sure my brother didn't mean to bother you."
He...
The girl he'd been dancing with grabbed his hand. "Enough, Ricky. Let's go." Ricky eyed her, then Brand, and back to her.
"Fine. You should teach that boy a lesson."
He turned around, grasped his girl by the hand, and departed. Brand sighed. Another fight averted. Not as smooth as usual, but he was tired from his 2-day trip from Wyoming. With one hand remaining on Bronc's shoulder, more to hold him steady than as a brotherly gesture, he turned to the group of ladies. "Hello, ladies. Name's Brand Cooper. How are you all this fine evening?" He pulled on the brim of his hat, then gave them the Cooper smile that had them all grinning back. Typical. Expected. There was never a night out at home where Brand didn't save his brother, then charm the ladyfolk, all in a night's work. Before he turned back to his twin, one girl caught his attention. She was blonde, blue-eyed, and petite, cute in her polka-dot dress. She was looking at him a bit dreamy-eyed. That was good. If he could get Bronc settled in a seat somewhere for the evening, he would have a little fun getting to know this young lady. Bronc shoved Brand's hand off his shoulder, causing himself to trip into his brother.
"She's mine,"
he growled into Brand's ear. Thankfully, the music had started again, and the ladies hadn't heard Bronc's claim of possession. "You're twins?" the curly-haired brunette said, stating the obvious. "Yep," another typical response. "You guessed it," Brand said with a half grin, as if she'd just won a contest. He waited for the next usual observation. "You look just alike," another brunette commented. And there it was. Brand held back the amused smile he wanted to give, then gave Bronc a slap on the back as he addressed the 6 ladies. "Let me get this fella settled, and we'll have a little chat." Most of them nodded, but the blonde polka-dot beauty didn't. Brand could see she was about to turn him down, so he jumped in. "Let me get you a refill on your—" He glanced at the table behind them. "Soda pops, and you can tell me about this little burg of yours. I'm new to the area." That stopped her. Her head tilted to one side. Her mind seemed to be spinning wheels over what he said, debating what to say next. He kept his mouth shut and waited for her to come to the conclusion he expected. They always did. Bronc got up too close, aiming at his ear. "They're church girls." Unsteady, he stumbled to one side. Brand grasped his collar at the neck to hold him up. He painted on another smile, this one forced. "Is that right?" He wondered what a bunch of church girls were doing in a bar, but maybe it was time to let them go. He'd never been shy around barflies, but church girls? What would he even talk about? At a loss for words for the first time in recent history, he floundered. Bronc jumped in. "Get us a drink, Nilla. Let's sit with them." Of all the times to use their dad's stupid nickname for him, Nilla, short for vanilla. Bronc didn't need any more to drink, but he would get him coffee, and the girls their soda pops. Sure. He planted Bronc in a chair that he nearly fell out of, then leaned down. "Behave yourself. Be right back." Bronc grinned up at him with obvious happiness. Brand addressed the group. "Would one of you ladies come with me? I don't know what you're drinking." Polka Dot jumped forward. "I'll help. You can't carry them all anyway." Bronc scowled. Brand nodded with a small smile, a little unsettled from Bronc's claim on her, as well as the church girl comment. But now wasn't the time to disagree. "Sure. Thanks." The crowd was thick with people dancing to another Chubby Checker song, Pony Time. This time the mass had their arms up in the air and were jerking to the whole new beat. Brand rolled his eyes at the craziness, but started to push his way through the crowd. Halfway to the bar, a quick glance back showed his little helper was getting swallowed up. Elbowing his way back to her, he reached for her hand, then pulled her in close to his body and muscled his way forward again. One young man tried to grab at her. Brand batted his hand away before he could touch her. His glare had the offender slinking off in another direction. Finally, facing the bartender, Brand tugged her forward, placing her palms on the smooth wood of the bar, then wrapped his big body around the back of her, planting his own hands on either side of hers. The smile from her sweet face showed him he hadn't offended her by his extreme protectiveness. "Hi, Uncle Marco. Can we have 6 Coca-Colas, please? And—" When she twisted her face to look up into his eyes with a question in hers, a new sensation punched him in the chest. And it wasn't physical. As he stared down into those wide eyes, he realized it was something deeper, more profound, and sort of sacred. He didn't understand what it was, but it hooked him straight into the heart. She had something, and it called to him. He forced his eyes away. "Brand?" Her honeyed voice drifted up to him as if he and she were the only 2 people in the bar. He glanced back and met her eyes. Her voice should have been drowned out by the loud racket, but he heard every inflection in the words sliding off her tongue. His name had never sounded so pleasing. He found himself wanting to ask her to say it again. He didn't have to. She did it all on her own. "Brand?" she said again, then giggled. As if the name weren't enough, the tinkle in that sound had the hook sinking deeper. He stood, staring and reeling until reason found its way through his brain. Bronc had already claimed this little miss, and there was nothing he could do about it. One thing he never ever did. He never went for a girl his brother was interested in. It was a brother's code, and more so for identical twins. That snapped him out of his infuriating musings. As if his ears had just popped open, he was struck with full force by the deafening music, boisterous laughter, and booming voices. He stepped back, then over to one side, tearing his eyes from hers and over to the bartender. 2 coffees, please, and put the girls' drinks on my tab."
"Sure thing, cowboy. How do you know my niece?"
her uncle said, then turned for the coffee pot. When he turned back, he grabbed 2 mugs from under the bar and filled them.
"Here you go."
Brand grinned. How would he answer that question? But he didn't have to. The little miss did it for him. "Just met him, Uncle Marco. He's here to rescue his brother." Interesting summation. He was here to rescue his brother, all right, but not from getting beat up, as she must have assumed. He was here to save Bronc from himself. As drunk as he was, he normally could slaughter the lumberjack. In Wyoming, Brand often saved other men from his brother. They always thought it would be an easy win against an inebriated Bronc. Never so. Bronc just got crazier when he drank. Brand was usually there to make sure Bronc didn't kill anybody, because Bronc would never forgive himself if he did, by accident or otherwise. But Brand wasn't so sure anymore. He hadn't seen Bronc in nearly a year, and tonight he'd already experienced Bronc's lack of strength and how quickly he was able to seize control. Brand decided nothing more needed to be said about his brother. He thanked her uncle, then picked up the tray full of soda pops. Balancing it over his head, he nodded for her to go ahead of him with the 2 mugs of coffee. This time she led him around the perimeter, the longer, safer way. Bronc was flirting it up with the other girls when they finally reached the table. Another true indication he was sloshed. Always the stoic one when sober. He thought people liked him so much better when he was charming. Problem was, that personality trait only showed up when he was drunk. It was the biggest lie of all. The people who loved him rejoiced when he was sober, irascible, grumpy, or the like. They wanted him as himself only. Brand and Julia delivered the drinks to the far end of the table. Then he stood a few feet away. He studied his brother unnoticed as Bronc slurred through a flirtation with the ladies. Something had changed from his usual drinking behavior since Brand had seen him last. Bronc drank too much, all right, and even got roaring drunk on occasion. But he never slurred, and he never stumbled, and he won every bar fight. Tonight, he seemed to be over the top, as if something weighed too heavily on him. Brand could feel it deep in his own soul, an inexplicable twin phenomenon. Had his time in California with Dad been too much for him? Brand didn't know, but he determined right then and there to solve the mystery. The sooner, the better. He stepped up, grabbed a chair, and sidled close to Bronc. "There he is," Bronc said as he tried to stand to greet Brand, but only collapsed back into his chair. Brand leaned in. "What's going on with you?" "What do you mean?" Bronc grinned his answer. "You never get this drunk back home." "Well, I got a lot to get drunk about." Then he laughed at himself. "I'm a drunk about. Is that like a walkabout while drinking?" He laughed again. Brand winced. "I'm taking you home," Brand said as he started to stand. Bronc grabbed his arm and tugged him back down. "No, we're talking to the girls." He was sure the girls were already sick of the drunk at their table. Brand scanned the group. All 6 of the women were staring wide-eyed at them with straws in their mouths as they sucked. all silent, and all except Polka Dot seemingly intrigued with Bronc. Oh, for crying out loud. He needed to get his brother out of here before he eventually embarrassed them both. Fine. He'd talk a bit, then take his opportunity to get Bronc moving. "What brings you to Al's place, ladies? You don't look like the type who frequent bars." One by one they slipped their lips off their straws. The curly-haired brunette spoke first. "It's the bartender's birthday. Julia's uncle." Oh, so that's why they were here. He just figured the place was always this busy. Now it made sense, though, and his interest in cute Polka Dot, Julia, rose. "So tell me, how long have you lived in Locke?" Brand scanned each girl one by one. Something he'd learned long ago. Show interest in all the girls in one party. Make them feel good about themselves. All the ladies graced him with giggles. "What's so funny?" he said, with a grin of his own. "Have you seen the population of Locke?" Julia said. "Small, huh?" He had noticed the population. Figured the sign was old. Guess not. "Yeah, only 80. So, what you're saying is you don't live here? Close?" "Yep. A couple of us live in Walnut Grove, just up the street that way," the quiet redhead said as she pointed to the south. "The rest in Lodi." The first time she spoke. Atta girl, Brand thought. He hated it when the shy girls got steamrolled by the talkative ones, and there was always a shy girl or two in every bunch. He grinned an encouraging grin at her. "Is that right? So if I drove out of town, that way," he pointed, "I'd come back up on the river road and eventually run right into Walnut Grove?" She nodded her head and smiled. "Cute. Okay, then. I'll need telephone numbers so I can call if I need guides around Walnut Grove or Lodi." They all started to giggle again, except Julia. She just stared and studied him. That was something he was prone to do. He loved to study people, figure out what made them tick. "Well, now what's so funny?" "Walnut Grove is too small to need a guide for. Lodi has nothing interesting," another girl who hadn't spoken yet said. This one was a bigger girl with a round face. He was happy she jumped in. "Well then, what's your name?" "Rose," she said, dropping her head in sudden shyness. "Well then, Rose, you're the first one I'm calling if I get lost." Her head came up. The blush had filled her face, he figured, because she dared talk to him. But the smile she was trying to hide gave her away. She'd been noticed by a man, probably for the first time in who knew how long. He made a mental note to be sure to include her in future discussions. If Bronc behaved, they'd stay longer and keep these girls talking. A quick glance in his direction gave him his answer. His brother was sipping his coffee and watching Brand in action. This was their usual routine at home. Bronc drank, flirted badly, got into fights, and would finally shut up and let Brand handle the people. He often wondered if he learned anything or if he would always let Brand socialize for them. He knew Bronc wasn't lazy. He just wasn't any good at handling women. Or anyone, for that matter. "You okay over there, Oates?" Brand used his dad's nickname, short for Wild Oats, as he usually did. It was their code that Brand was watching over them, and everything would be all right. Bronc gave him a half-smile and nodded, then took a gulp of his coffee. Bronc looked relieved Brand was with them now. That made the long trip worth it. Brand was needed, and he was happy he'd come. Chapter 3. "Get your bum out of bed, lazy bones," Brand's voice. Familiar, comforting, and annoying as heck. "Leave me alone," Bronc grumbled into his pillow. He was lying face down on the mattress, his body's favorite way to sleep, especially when he'd been drinking. Somehow Brand had gotten him back home to Harper Ranch West. He didn't remember a thing. "Time to get up. There's work to do." He kicked the side of the bed, jarring Bronc's head and sloshing his stomach. "How the heck did Dad ever get you up?" Dad. He was the only one who could get Bronc to move without being physical. He often wondered about that. Was it out of fear? Nah, too old to be afraid. So he had to admit to himself it must be out of respect. It was a hard truth to believe. "Out," Brand said, dragging him by one arm from the bed until he fell with a loud thump against the floorboards. "Ouch, you jerk! Do you always have to bust my bones?" "If you're not moving or listening, yeah. Whatever works." Bronc smiled into the small rug his face was currently smashed into. It was good to have his brother here, though he'd never let him know it. But it had been too long. He'd been craving the connection. Another truth to face. He didn't do well without his twin. "Do I have to drag you to the main house? I've already been there. Breakfast is ready. Looks like Rebecca's mom is a good cook, unlike her daughter." Brand chuckled. "The spread looks amazing. Smells even better." Even though Bronc's stomach rolled at the thought of food, he agreed Marie was about the best cook he'd come across. It was a wonder Norman wasn't as big as a house. He knew firsthand, though, ranch and farm life kept you trim. Of course, lately, Norm had socked on a few extra pounds while recuperating from his fall off the back of the tractor onto the disc that nearly severed his leg. The horrific accident took him out of commission, bringing Bronc and his dad to California to help him. He was healing, but well enough to farm again? Bronc doubted it. Not that they all didn't hope. Bronc had learned more about farm work than he'd ever wanted to while at Harper West. Still, as a rancher, it couldn't hurt to know how to grow things, especially alfalfa. They didn't grow this back on Cooper Bar 6 Ranch, but they should. An alfalfa grass mix was a much better hay to feed animals. It provided more protein than grass alone, but half the bloat risk of pure alfalfa. Plus, it was easier to grow in his opinion. He'd be talking to Trevor about possibly growing it when he got back home. If he ever got back home. "Get up. I know you're not still drunk. Gave you bunches of water before I let you sleep." Yeah, he learned long ago to follow Brand's advice when it came to how to avoid the worst hangovers. Extra water before sleep was one way, snacking on nuts while he drank another. He raised himself to his hands and knees. Not all that strong today. He had been losing strength lately. Hard to believe since farm work packed on extra muscle. "What's going on with you? You didn't used to drink this much." Brand hoisted Bronc to his feet, steadied and examined him, using his Brand powers. This was something Bronc hadn't missed. Brand and their dad both did this inspecting thing, like they could see straight to his soul through his eyes. He hated it. "Knock it off. You won't find nothing there but bloodshot whites." "What's up, brother? You're not making any points with Dad, or the girls last night." "What are you talking about? The girls loved me. I'm more like you when I'm drunk. Charming." Bronc rolled his eyes and shook his head. "Let's get you dressed. Dad is not happy we're not at the breakfast table." Bronc's temperature started to rise. Dad needed to lay off. Still, he stumbled around the room, finding clothes to dress in. The little house already wasn't very big. But with Brand in it with him, it had downright shrunk. One bedroom with 2 single beds, a small living room with a couch, tiny kitchen, and an indoor bathroom he'd just put in. He headed there while he gathered more clothes. At least the small dwelling gave him a needed separation from all the people who'd seemed to have an eagle eye on him. He was tired of being judged. Maybe Brand could get them to back off, if he was willing. Once he'd visited the bathroom and got dressed, he led Brand outside, then into the main house through the kitchen door. They strode up to the dining table, all loaded with a team of people. Their dad, Rebecca, Marie, Norman, and the 3 Mexican laborers, Alfred, Gilbert, and Herman. "Did you meet everyone already?" he asked Brand. "Nope. Just saw Dad so far this morning. And the food." "Ah. Well, come on over here." He gestured for his brother to stand next to him near Norman at the head of the table. "Everyone, this is my brother Brand." The table talk exploded into retorts about Brand being his identical twin. It was beyond obvious. Even Bronc acknowledged that it had to be like seeing copies of the same person walk into a room, especially since today they were dressed nearly identically. Denim jeans, brown work boots, black hats, and cotton plaid shirts, both with sleeves shoved up to the elbows. They neither one ever rolled them, which was a weird habit that drove everyone around them nuts. They looked sloppy. Plus, they were forever pushing up their sleeves. Still, he and Brand hated the tedium of folding up little cuffs in their sleeves. Took too much time. Today, the only difference in their appearance was that Brand's shirt was red, white, and blue plaid, whereas Bronc's was black and gray. Typical. His brothers were usually dark in color. Felt like it matched his soul. It was only one of the choices where he and Brand differed. Bronc shoved his sleeves up, then started the introductions, pointing at each person as he rounded the table. "This is Norman, owner of Harper West, and Rebecca's dad. Her mom, Marie." Brand's eyes drifted to Norman's leg. He cleared his throat. "Real good to meet you both. Thank you for your hospitality." As Brand stepped forward to give Rebecca's parents a hug, Bronc felt deeply satisfied at seeing this mirror image of himself hugging 2 people who would have remained complete strangers without Rebecca entering their lives. 2 people who meant so much to him now. Brand continued around the table to shake their dad's hands and then give Rebecca a quick hug. "You look great, Rebecca." She gave him a glorious smile. "I'm glad you made it here safely. I know that drive is a travail." Brand chuckled as his eyes danced to Bronc's. They always shared a moment when Rebecca's word choice made her sound like she was born in the wrong century. It was especially endearing because she wasn't all that much older than them. But somehow, she carried herself with the maturity and kindness one could only hope for from a new stepmom. "I'm right glad to be here, travail or no," Brand said, with a wink to her, then extended his hand to the person seated next to her. "And you are—" Bronc continued. "That there's Alfred, then Gilbert, and Herman. Gilbert and Herman are only here until the harvest is in. Then they head back to their families in Mexico until next year. Alfred stays year-round and helps with the herd and the horses." He watched as Brand completed his circuit around the table and took his seat in the extra chair that had been squeezed in next to him. Brand's help was going to be timely. They were overwhelmed with work while harvesting the field corn, milo maize, and alfalfa. According to Norman, they never harvested all at once like this, but they were late this year due to September rains. Norman was jittery about all the heat and humidity. Poor Norman. On top of trying to heal from the horrific accident, this late harvest with all the rains made mold a real problem for the type of crops he was growing this year. Bronc's heart went out to him, seeing as how that sentiment was completely foreign to him. He put it to good use and kept a sharp eye out for mold. So far, they were in the clear. All they could do now was get the harvest done quickly and hope the selling price remained stable. The problem now was Bronc wasn't himself. He knew it. His dad knew it, and now Brand had noticed. Ever since the news of the latest sabotage on Bar 6, Bronc couldn't quite shake the fact that it was his fault. Brand shoved the good eats down his gullet as he followed the conversation around the table. He was a sponge, learning what he could, but his main focus was his brother. Though Bronc was eating, his hands shook, his blinks were slow, and he hadn't spoken since the introductions. A grimace tweaked his cheek now and then. Bronc wasn't talkative, but he usually had plenty to say about the ranch operations back home, quick to give his opinion, which was usually spot on if their brother Trevor ever took his advice. But today, Brand didn't know if it was because Bronc didn't know farm life as well, or if the hangover was getting the best of him. Brand couldn't quite shake that it was something else. After eating their fill and bussing their dishes to the sink, Brand followed Bronc through the kitchen to the back entrance of the house. Just before Brand closed the door behind him, Dad called him back. "I'll be right behind you. Don't leave without me," he hollered after Bronc, then looked over his shoulder to see what his dad wanted.
Close the door. His dad was alone and near.
Brand complied, frowned, and waited.
"Where'd you find him last night?"
"Al's place."
"Was he drunk?"
Brand hesitated. Somehow, saying yes right now seemed like a betrayal to his brother, reminding him that he and Dad were on the same side, to help Bronc. He nodded once.
"Bad?"
"Bad." Cord cursed and ran a hand down his face, then planted his hands on his hips.
"Was he able to walk out to your truck?"
"With an arm slung over my shoulder, yeah. The ranch truck is still there."
"I was afraid of that.
"We're going to need it. You better start with that today." "Shouldn't you have told Bronc that? He's been working with you here for over 10 months, Dad. I'm not going to take his place. That would be the worst thing for him. I'll tell him the order of things this time, since I was involved in bringing him home without his truck. But not again. You need to go through him for the two of us. It's only right." Cord's eyes drifted off toward the small window by the door, as if the solutions to all Bronc's problems would be listed there.
You're right.
Such wisdom for one so young. He mumbled mostly to himself. "I'm letting my worry cloud my judgment." He turned his gaze back to Brand. "Rebecca says not to go before God. Calling you was the only clear answer we got after we'd spent the last few weeks praying and agonizing over this." Brand winced. What could prayer do? What Bronc needed was some serious attention, something their dad had never given any of them. And then again, after being absent for their entire childhoods, he likely didn't know how. Consequently, no Cooper was emotionally healthy. Of course, he had to admit, once he fell in love, as did Clay, Colt, and Hunter, they improved in that category.
"After a few months here, he seemed better."
Standing this close to his dad, Brand could see worry lines. He had aged.
"His attitude was improving." I allowed myself to hope. Then it was like he fell off the deep end.
His dad scrubbed a hand over his eyes, and if Brand weren't mistaken, catching tears. "I'll figure it out, Dad. I always do. The one thing we can agree on, he's a shadow of his former self, and that guy wasn't healthy already." His dad nodded, sadness heavy in his glistening eyes. Then he gestured for Brand to continue on his way. Outside, Bronc had pulled up in an international pickup truck with both doors missing and sat idling, waiting for him. Instead of getting in the passenger side, Brand strode straight up to his brother. "We need to get the ranch truck we left at Al's place. Al the Wops, the locals call it." "Fine, Al the Wops. The truck is needed back here." "Dad tell you that?" Shoot. He shouldn't have approached it this way.
Bronc picked up on everything, especially when it had to do with his own failings. "Yep, I was the last one out of the house. He said to tell you. Let's go get it first. But we can't take this." Brand swept an arm out, indicating the doorless truck. Yeah, I know. Get in. The Chevy's at the point." Jogging around the hood, Brand easily leapt onto the seat. "The point?" "The front, where the cattle are kept. The property kind of comes to a point there." As they slowly cruised up the only road to the front of the ranch, Bronc started to say something, but Brand jumped in. Bronc had been ready to complain about Dad usurping his authority. Brand was sure of it. That intuition twins had kept him alerted. "Why'd they take the doors off?" Bronc rolled his jaw, still teetering on speaking his mind, then relented. "Easier to jump in and out. Irrigating, closing gates, checking crops, rescuing stuck cattle. You know, ranch and farm stuff." "Can't believe you're driving so slow. Never seen you do that." "Go too fast and you'll get yelled at. The road's dried out some today. It dusts the crops. After a while, the first few rows get heavy with dirt. Kills 'em. Trust me. After getting reamed out so many times, I stopped doing it." After retrieving the road-worthy Chevy, Bronc drove the 20 minutes to the dip in the road that was Locke. He slowed, then parallel parked right in front of the ranch truck he'd brought last night. It looked okay. The Friday night crowd had left it alone. He let out a deep sigh of relief, feeling the tension drain away. That's all he needed was for the truck to be broken into or stolen. He'd already been chewed out for more things than he'd cared to think about. By Dad, Norman, even the womenfolk. If only he'd picked up and leave. And why not? He was nearly 23 after all. He'd been an adult for years. As the youngest, he still got picked on like he was 15. He and Brand were the same age, yet his twin was treated like he was Trevor's age. He was sick of it. "You okay?" Brand cut into his thoughts. "Yeah, fine," he growled. One glance at his brother and he saw the truth. Brand would stay silent. Let Bronc brood in peace. He was even sick of how wise and compassionate his brother was. All the time. Just as he threw the gear shift into neutral and shut down the engine, his eyes caught a yellow-dressed chick stepping up onto the boardwalk, heading for the front door of Al's. She didn't even glance their way so he could get a good look at her, but what he could see was pleasing indeed. "Oh, there's Julia," Brand said with a wide smile. Bronc felt the familiar emotion of being left out of something. Happened frequently back home, more so lately. "Who's Julia? And how would you know anyone from around here?" Brand glowered at him. "We met her last night. Or were you too deep in your cups to remember?" Brand jumped out of the pickup and banged the door shut before heading for the front door of the restaurant after Julia. He caught up to her before she entered the building. Bronc was right on his heels. Brand tipped his hat. "Good morning, Polka Dot. How are you this fine morning?" Bronc wanted to bark curse words at Brand. He was too charming. And what was with the nickname? She twirled to a stop and looked up into Brand's face. If he wasn't mistaken, there were stars in her eyes. "Brand?" She glanced behind Brand and saw him, then nodded. "Yeah, Brand," she said mostly to herself, refocusing on his twin. As a stranger, how did she know that, when most people who knew them couldn't tell them apart? "How are you today?" She smiled with that extra impact women did when interested, really interested. Abruptly, that smile unclogged his alcohol-ravaged brain. Now he remembered her. He'd met her before Brand showed up, and liked her instantly. A thrill shot through him. He'd called dibs on her first. High school antics or not, the recollection emboldened him. He moved around to Brand. "Good morning, Julia. Did your uncle have a good birthday party last night?" Proud of himself for remembering that important piece of information and delivering it smoothly, he gifted her with the famous Cooper grin. She lit up with a smile of her own. "Good morning to you, Bronc. How are you feeling today?" So, that hadn't been a sweet smile, but a snarky one. He felt his temperature rise. Breathing in slowly, he calmed himself. He couldn't risk letting his temper out. "Good. And you?" "Well, since I was only drinking Coca-Cola last night, I'm feeling just fine." Brand had been hanging back, no doubt remembering who had dibs. But now he jumped in, as he always did before Bronc could bury himself in the wrong words. "So, did you forget something here last night? Or is his birthday actually today? Having a birthday breakfast?" Her gaze swung back to Brand, and she smiled again. Not the mocking one, he noticed. Mr. Charm had done it again. "I left my sweater on the chair back. I'm just here to pick it up and say hello to my uncle. Then I'm off to church." Brand's face fell. His mouth twisted to one side as it usually did when something displeased him. It figured his brother wouldn't like church talk. Bronc finally got his composure back. "You work there?" "I do." Her expression showed she was contemplating something as she rolled in her lips. Then she finally spit it out. "My dad's the senior pastor there." The look on Brand's face could have horrified a small child. Nearly made Bronc laugh. Yeah, neither one of them was into religion. In Bronc's case, he was indifferent. But Brand practically vibrated with revulsion when confronted with God discussions. No one else could tell, but Bronc could. In fact, when he was in a mood, he dragged Brand through all kinds of torment with discussions of God and Jesus and church and the Bible, just to watch him squirm. It was hilarious. Brand was backing up, getting ready to run off. "Okay, good. See you around. Good to see you. Take care. Bye now." Bronc wanted to rub it in, but wasn't in the mood to annoy his brother. He'd been good about coming out to California, after all. "So, do you live around here?" Bronc asked her. "Yes. Do you remember I told you last night?" He ground his back teeth. "Forgot." "Yeah, you probably forgot." Her eyebrows were twitching like she was trying not to frown. She finally pasted a smile on her face. "Walnut Grove." "What?" "That's where I live. Walnut Grove, just up the river that way." She pointed in the opposite direction from where they had come. "Oh, maybe I can visit you sometime?" With a frown on her lovely face, her eyes darted to Brand as he slunk off toward the truck. Well, listen, I've got to go." She gestured nervously toward Al's door. "Okay, sure. Will you be coming back here any time soon?" Another glance at Brand, and she shrugged. "I only come here for supper sometimes." "Oh?" He smiled hopefully. "When?" "Will your brother be coming with you?" Bronc narrowed his eyes. What did it matter to her if which brother she saw? They were identical. But if he was going to get a chance with her, he needed to play nice. "Sure. We're usually joined at the hip," he teased. She smiled a real smile then and nodded. "Well, I'm usually here with my friends on Wednesday nights before church to get a bite to eat. About 5. "Okay. See you Wednesday. Have a good week until then." "Yeah, you too." Tell your brother bye for me." She looked over at the truck and saw Brand leaning against it and gave a little wave. Brand pulled on his hat brim, but only offered a small smile. "Bye, Julia." Bronc watched her disappear through the door of the restaurant, then he turned back to Brand. Once he was within a few feet of him, he scowled. "What's up with you? A little talk of church and you scurry off like a rodent back to your burrow. You know how I feel about God talk. Got enough of that with Hunter lately. The guy's smitten with his little fiancée and her love of God. He's turned it just like Dad, Colt, and Clay. What's happening to the Cooper men? Find a woman, then lose your manhood? It's crazy. When I find a good woman, she'll be independent and self-sufficient. And if she ever does need help, she'll lean on me. There will be no need to lean on an invisible God." Bronc stared straight into his brother's hazel eyes, identical to his own, unable to decipher his thoughts. But he'd never heard Brand talk this way before. Usually, he was an advocate for everyone, no matter what the circumstances. "You okay, brother?" Bronc asked, seriously concerned. "Yeah, let's go. We've got work back at the ranch. You got your keys in your pocket, right?" Bronc nodded, still searching Brand's face for some kind of clue about his anger. None was forthcoming. "I'll follow you back," Brand said. For the time being, Bronc gave up trying to figure Brand out and turned for the truck. They both jumped into their individual vehicles and peeled off toward the ranch. Maybe Bronc wouldn't run off to better places just yet. First, he had to make sure Brand would be okay without him. That was a laugh, really, since for their whole lives Brand had been taking care of him. But something was up, and maybe it was his turn to do the watching over. Chapter 4. Brand followed at a distance behind Bronc along the windy river road. Bronc was accelerating through the turns, fishtailing and correcting fast, putting those tires on the rails for the straightaways as Brand struggled to keep up. Bronc had driven like a perfect gentleman on the way to the diner, with Brand as his passenger, but he was letting loose now, only putting himself in danger. Never anyone else. Never on purpose. But when he was alone... Bronc's taillights flashed too briefly, then more gravel shot out from under his rear tires. His truck roared, and the wheels gained traction again. Was he trying to kill himself? Brand had thoroughly enjoyed the reprieve when Bronc went west. The minute he saw Bronc with his fist cocked back last night, all the anxiety and responsibility of being his brother's keeper landed back on Brand's shoulder with a dull thud. This visit was going to be no cakewalk. One thing Brand had to admit, being away from the Bar 6 gave him another kind of respite. Trevor was probably more broken than Bronc, but at least he hid it better under the pretense of work. What a case they all were. At least no one knew he was a mess, too. Bronc's truck took the next turn wide and squirreled its way back into the lane. Brand didn't want to watch anymore. He took his foot off the gas and directed his gaze toward the Sacramento River. He rolled his neck side to side and took a long, slow breath. Nature always gave him peace. He knew his way back well enough, so he slowly cruised along the delta. Brand took his time coming into the ranch, curious about the layout of this 702-acre property. He hadn't been able to see much when he arrived after dark last night. He nosed the truck over the elevated railroad tracks and down their wall. He passed what appeared to be a pump house, then rattled his way onto the gravel ranch road at the far north end of the spread. He had to laugh at how similar it was to the road into Cooper Bar 6. Potholes galore. From his perch, he could see the property was shaped like an immense arrowhead, and he was at its tip. He put the gear shift in neutral and studied the land. In one conversation with his dad a few months ago, he learned some things that he could now view firsthand. On the far left, a massive water channel ran down the length of the ranch. His dad had said this was the borrow pit. Brand had questioned if that meant they borrowed the water for irrigation, though they did use the water to do just that. The waterway got its nickname when the railroad company had borrowed the dirt to erect the levee right beside it for their tracks on the ranch's east side. The rail line had long since been abandoned, but the tracks were still there. Borrow pit water might have seemed like a win initially, but from this higher vantage point, Brand immediately saw the problem. Crops as far as the eye could see filled the ranch from the railroad levee along the eastern border to the slough levee along the western border. The main road split the ranch in two and made its way to the center camp, where two bunkhouses, the main house, the smaller house behind, a work shed, and the gas pumps could barely be seen from this distance. The road continued alongside the ditch, covering the whole length of the ranch. Brand's eyes caught the glint of sun off more water to the south. That meant the slough, Snodgrass Slough if he remembered right, curved there to define the southern property line as well. Given the brimming borrow pit off to his left as he reached his entrance, Harper West was an island surrounded by water. No wonder the ranch had flooded in places during harsh rain years. The crops, housing, equipment, everything except the cattle pastures to the north were on low ground. How had Norman not already died of a heart attack from worrying about losing everything whenever the sky opened up? Of course, this was California, not Wyoming. The sounds of lowing reeled Brand's attention back to the herd of black Angus off to his right. The cattle were yammering at each other as they moseyed toward a hay truck. Brand did a double take. That was the truck Bronc had been driving back from the diner. He must have been flying down the road to get back, load hay into the bed, and be well into the chore already. Bronc was still in the driver's seat. Someone else was forking the hay out of the truck bed, smaller than the rest and shapely. Definitely not a man. So, his twin had himself a female helper. Interesting. Wonder why he never mentioned her. Pulling forward to not block the one-lane road, Brand strode down the road a short distance away, down a slope to the barn, and parked. He let himself out and jogged back up to the road, squinting at his brother and helper in the distance. With hands on his hips, he watched as they finished feeding the cattle. The sun glinted off another water channel to the north of the pasture. What a crazy property. This could only ever happen in a state known for drought. If it was located in Wyoming with the erratic and more severe weather systems, no one would own it. With the bed empty of hay, Bronc eased his truck onto the main dirt road and idled slowly forward toward the barn, only to then rev the engine and pretend to run Brand over. Brand jumped to the side and strode up to the driver's side. "That's why we call you Wild Oats. Trying to kill off your competition?" Bronc laughed with him. This was an ongoing and very real rivalry between them, to beat each other out when it came to the fairer sex. Brand felt a little guilty about that, since he was the one who usually came out on top. Bronc had the same looks, but was too volatile, most of the time too drunk, and too unpredictable for the ladies. The woman in the bed of the truck jumped off the back and strode confidently up to Brand. "Well, now, looky here. I've been told he had a twin." She grinned a sassy, sunny grin. Brand took in her features. Seriously attractive features. "Amazing how you could pass for each other. Not all twins could do that." Smart girl, and so right. "I'm Brand, and you are—" She bit down on the fingertips of her glove and yanked it off, catching it with her other hand. Offering her gloveless hand to him, she said, "I'm Shell. Good to meet you." Brand grinned and shook her hand. impressed with her bold, strong handshake. "Shell? Well, that's unusual. It's short for Shelley. The men call me Shell." "Shell it is, then. Good to meet you, too. Are you Bronc's helper?" As he held her hand a little longer than necessary, she gave him another solid shake, then slipped her hand free of his. "Everyone's helper. Ever since Norm hurt himself." Her smile dimmed. He shook his head. "That's good he survived it." She nodded. "It was touch and go there for a while. You staying long? We could sure use the help." "As long as needed." "You like what you see so far?" The smile returned as she swung her arm around the acreage. Brand ripped his gaze off her brown eyes and took it all in again. "I've never seen a ranch quite like this one. Been thinking it's a bit of a risk." "Huh? What do you mean?" Her brows knit together, making her eyes narrow, showing off thick black lashes full of hay dust. The dirt and sweat did nothing to diminish her natural beauty. Light brown hair with strands on the top and ends kissed by the sun. A wholesome outdoors girl for sure. "Surrounded by water. What happens in the winter?" Her face softened. She nodded. "Never thought of it as risky before, but you're right. It is an island, so, yeah, they can flood. It has. Poor Norman. He has a lot on his plate, especially after his injury." "What happened there?" Bronc threw his door open and hurled himself out, facing the two. "You two think you've bonded long enough? Got work to do." He swallowed hard, then glared, stuffing the truck keys into his pocket with a white fist. The hangover was probably tearing up his insides. Brand needed to have the talk with him their dad asked him to have, about life choices. The sooner the better. Shell didn't seem fazed. She smiled, another beatific one that made her eyes twinkle. Brand wondered if Bronc had noticed this girl, really noticed her. Even though she was in worn-out ranch clothes with a floppy cowboy hat pulled down to her brows, Brand could see she had all the assets of a desirable woman. "Get back to work, Shell. You have horses to feed." Brand scowled at Bronc. Hadn't he listened to a thing Brand had tried to teach him through the years? Of course, this was nothing new, especially the day after a bender. And according to their dad, he'd had quite a few of those lately. Bronc started off for the barn and apparently the International that was parked there, throwing a last-minute thought over his shoulder at his ranch hand. "In case anyone asks, we've gone to the south end. Gonna show Brand around." Brand frowned at his brother's back, then planted on a smile before he turned his head to her. He tapped his hat brim. "Nice to meet you, Shell. See you later?" Her brows came together, forming two lines in between them. She looked taken aback by his question. "Well, yeah, sure. Later." A stunned smile, small and hesitant, bent up at the corners of her lips. Huh. It was like no one talked to her that way. Ever. Now he was really going to rake his twin over the coals. "Leave her be, Brand. We won't see her for the rest of the day. She has work to do." Bronc slapped him on the back on his way to the truck. Nothing to do but follow him, then drill him for answers on their way. Shell didn't say another word, just scooted off to her own Ford pickup and bounded in. A glance back showed she was following them. She swung in close. "Hop on. I'll give you two a ride to your wheels." Bronc always looked for ways to trim time and energy, so he jumped onto the runner and struck his arm through the open window to grip the door. Brand joined him on the passenger side, barely grabbing on before she took them on down the short hill to the barn. When Bronc jumped off without her stopping, Brand did the same. Brand gave her a wave as he jumped into the cab. "Interesting girl." Bronc brought the truck to life and took them down the road toward the center camp. He didn't respond to Brand's comment. You paying her for all this work? Brand asked. Dunno. None of my business. She's attractive. Known her long? Been with me for months now. She's a pain in the butt, but a good enough worker, I guess. Neighbor's daughter. Nice of the neighbor to lend his daughter. I'm sure he could use her himself. Her father owns the biggest spread in the county. Wealthy. Doesn't need her. Hires plenty of men. Well, how does she feel about that? Bronc glared out the windshield as he slowed enough that Brand could practically count the tules and cattails in the ditch on the driver's side of the road. No answer was forthcoming from Bronc. Brand waited as long as he could stand it. Usually, Bronc was a little more interactive with him, at least. Probably the hangover. Bronc? What? Well, how does she feel about that? Well, how the heck would I know? Not into deciphering women's feelings, as you well know. You're the dang counselor in the family. Bronc grunted his disapproval, using his thumb and middle finger to rub his temples. He looked miserable and a little green. Need to blow chunks? Jeez, Brand, you always make it worse. Shut the heck up. Just sit there and look pretty. That's like saying you think you're pretty. No, I'm the rugged twin. You're the pretty, sensitive one. I'm all of it, little brother. Brand relished his status as older brother, even if it was by mere minutes. It was a surefire way to rile Bronc up. And oh, how Brand missed teasing his twin. Brand shrugged. I'm rugged, good-looking, considerate, responsible, hard-working. Gag me. The girls like me better. And here I thought you didn't lie. We both know who they like best and who they just put up with. Bronc rolled his lips in and bit down. Why is she a pain in your butt? What? Shell. You said she's a pain in my butt. I haven't missed you. Liar. You're a pain, just like her. Aw, now we're getting somewhere. She's watching out for you. Chapter 5. Bronc wasn't the one who needed watching over. Norman was. People around here had gotten lax about that, and there just wasn't enough air in the cab for both Brand and him right now, even on the doorless truck. Bronc swung off the road and onto the grass in front of the house. He threw the gear shift into neutral, then jumped out. I'll be right back. He didn't bother to check Brand's expression. Instead, he boomed through the back door at the kitchen and marched to the living room. There he found Norman watching the Today Show on his new RCA television set. Marie had finally bought it for him after he'd driven her crazy by moping and complaining that he felt useless. After nearly amputating his leg when he fell off his tractor onto the disc harrow blades, Norman was looking at a long recovery. So the doctors had said, and so far, Norman had proven them right. But his road to recovery was especially rough. He'd seemed to get stronger, walking with nothing more than a catch in his step, and then would turn as weak and shaky as a puppy all over again, unable to bear any weight at all on the leg. Long recovery, yes, but the seesawing baffled his doctors. Bronc stopped near Norman and watched the show for a few seconds, then glanced back at the man, whose placid expression was set like carved stone. That meant pain. Something tightened inside Bronc's chest. Something he'd never felt for his own father. It threatened to squeeze the breath out of him in its relentless embrace. You okay, old man? Need anything? Nah. Go make yourself useful, son, he barked. But Bronc knew that bark. It didn't fool him one bit. It was the one that kept everyone away from him, designed to keep his family from worrying about him. Bronc used that same bark, but it was different for him. In Norman's case, it was the physical ailment that he knew could still take his life. In Bronc's case, It was to keep his loved ones from the harm only he could inflict on them. Inflicting pain was the only thing he was truly good at. I'm going to take Brand to the south end, show him the hyacinth he'll be helping me clear. Norman tore his gaze off the TV and onto him.
What makes you think I'll let him help you? That's a lone project, son. Yours.
You're there.
I supervise. Gotta watch over you. Make sure you do it right.
Oh, sure. Bronc wanted to laugh. Anyone who had a brain could do this work. The problem was, it was like digging a hole and filling it back up over and over. It was never truly done. The dang weed was tenacious. He'll be another set of hands. You don't want the hyacinth to start winning again, Norm. If you want it out of the borrow pit, we'll need my brother's help.
Do you not see we're also harvesting, boy? 2 crops. Alfalfa will make 3. We need him there.
He'd raised his voice. That always worried Bronc. He shouldn't overdo it. The truth was, Bronc knew the hyacinth had been his punishment. He'd never been afraid of hard work, but he also, under no uncertain terms, had not wanted to come to California with his dad. Those first few months, he was surly and rude, more so than usual, when asked to do anything. Norman decided to give him a task so futile he'd either have to pull a U-turn on his attitude or face the hyacinth duty full time. Bronc was a man reborn. What his dad had been unable to do in months, Norm had accomplished in 2 weeks. Bronc's respect for the old man grew. Pride swelled when he thought of the fact they'd actually gotten somewhere with the eradication along the way. They'd started out with a simple potato hoe along the edges of the borrow pit. Had gotten nowhere. It wasn't until they started using the dragline, Bronc's idea, that they started seeing results. Not only was Bronc excited he was accomplishing something good for the ranch, but he had also gotten an interesting education along the way. Who knew Norm could be such a storyteller, and that his accounts of his service in World War I would be so interesting? And then there were the stories from the Bible. Bronc had grown close to this special man, Rebecca's dad, his step-grandpa. Another revelation crept up on him the longer he knew Norm. One that finally made sense. Rebecca had a big heart and was able to love her older husband, Bronc's dad, to distraction. Before meeting Norm, Bronc had his suspicions why Rebecca would marry his dad, a man 17 years her senior. After all these months observing her, now he knew it was pure love and adoration. She'd inherited that loving spirit from her own dad, the most loving and giving man Bronc had ever known, a man who had gained Bronc's trust and his love. Once Bronc had noticed what was happening, he kept it to himself. As far as anyone still knew, Bronc hated the world and everyone in it. He wanted to keep it that way. Fine, I'll still show him the project, in case you change your mind. Truth was, he wanted Norm all to himself. Brand could quite possibly become Norm's favorite. It was just a matter of time. That prospect hurt more than Bronc would have thought possible. But the hyacinth was his way of serving Norm and loving him back, no matter the cost. Then I'll take him to Dad and Alfred. They can put him to work. Norm gave him his usual curt nod, then turned his attention back to the television, effectively dismissing him. "Where you been?" Brand asked, annoyed, once Bronc jumped back into the driver's seat. "Talking to Norm." "About what?" "Your tasks here on the ranch. I'm taking you to the south end, then he wants you to work on the harvest." He pulled the gear shift into first and continued south on the dirt road. Spine stiff, Brand yanked the arm he had been lazily resting along the back of the seat into his lap. "What do I know about harvesting anything but hay?" "You'll learn. Dad or Alfred will teach you, or show you what else to do." Why haven't you been harvesting all this time?" "I'm being punished." Brand rotated to stare into his face. "Punished? For what?" The truck dipped into a pothole with a screech from the shocks, making Bronc smirk and Brand frown. It was Cooper Bar 6 all over again. "Bad behavior. Norm put me to work on the worst job on the ranch. Gave it to me to straighten me out," he said. "Well, for crying out loud, Bronc, you need to start getting along with people. You cause more grief for yourself every time you use that mouth of yours. Haven't you learned anything from me yet?" "Ah, the good twin and his indispensable charm. Don't you get it, Brandon? I don't want to be anything like you." Brand growled. "You sure about that? You do know you have to work double hard to get anywhere with people because of your dang mouth." Bronc smashed his floppy hat down on his head and sped up, creating a whirlwind of dust behind the truck. "See there? Because you riled at me, you're already getting yourself into trouble, stirring up dust. No crops. This is where I blow off steam." Brand glanced around, and sure enough, the fields were full of empty stalks from field corn and milo. They'd gotten a lot done already. Bronc braked, sliding to a stop, then swung left, maneuvering the truck down an even narrower road, along a small ditch that dumped into the borrow pit on the southeast side. A tall excavator sat silently on the bank before them. "There it is," Bronc said. If Brand wasn't mistaken, and he rarely was when it came to his twin, there was pride in his voice. He waited to hear the story. They hopped out of the doorless truck simultaneously, mirror images of each other. Brand's gaze took in the acres of purple-flowered hyacinth, scattered for as far as the eye could see on top of the water. Pretty, yes, but what a mess. "See this excavator?" Bronc raised his eyes to the top of the boom. Brand nodded. The thing loomed over them like a sentinel standing guard over a floating garden. "I've been scooping the water hyacinth out with the bucket, but every time you scoop, the surrounding hyacinth fills back in," Brand said, completing Bronc's thought. "It's simple, but time-consuming." Brand oogled the heaping berm of excavated plants along each bank, drying in the sun. Eyeing the remainder in the pit, he asked with a wince, "How long you been at it?" "Months," Bronc harumphed, clearly knowing what Brand was thinking. "It's stubborn." There was that gratification in his voice again, and a small smile on his face. He was proud of the accomplishment only he could see. Brand didn't want to discourage him. "Stubborn, I'll say." Pot met kettle. His sidelong glance at Bronc wasn't lost on his brother. Bronc glared back. He raised his hands, palm out in surrender. "Hey, just making an observation is all. You've obviously put the work in. With this—" Brand's voice drifted off as he teetered on the edge of an internal cliff. "What's that supposed to mean?" Bronc's expression darkened. He shrugged, his insides a roiling mess. Bronc faced him square on, nose to nose. "Spill." He swallowed, then stepped off the cliff. "You've been drinking heavy. Dad says. More than usual." Bronc's expression was stony. Seconds clipped by. His nostrils flared. "Is that why you're out here? Not to help Norman, but to drill me? About my bad habits?" He lifted his old floppy hat and used a forearm to rub the sweat from his brow, then stuffed the thing back on so hard that Brand could barely see his face. When Brand did not respond, Bronc turned his back and stomped off, sending puffs of dirt up into the air, cursing like a sailor. He started to climb into the truck, but circled back. His voice rose an octave. Are you telling me Dad dragged you from that short-handed Trevor to babysit me? Shoot. He should not have brought Dad into this. Too late now. Calm down. He's worried. Bronc twisted back, then did another about-face, nearly burying his boots in the thick sod. So, you're telling me he's not worried about his oldest son back in Wyoming, trying to hold his father's ranch together? Doesn't care about the injured guy who can't walk after months of healing? No, he's only worried about whether I chose beer or whiskey tonight. Is that what you're telling me? He always knew how to deal with Bronc. Stay cool. Don't ever let on that your gut is churning and your emotions are firing like a severed telephone pole wire. You said it. The optimal word, brother. Tonight. Bronc screwed up his face, looking at him as if he'd lost his mind. You'll be going to drink again tonight. That's what Dad's worrying about. You're an alcoholic, Bronc. You have been for quite some time. But he's let it go, hoping you'd grow out of it somehow. But you and I know better, don't we? We all drink now and then. But you get drunk every single night. A big difference. Bronc stomped back toward him, looking like he might knock his block off. What are you going to do? Hit me? Prove to me how out of control you are? Bronc's face filled with crimson rage, his hands fisting and unfisting. He tilted his head to the sky and yelled until he had no breath left. Why did you come here, Vanilla? To make a bigger mess of my life? Or to play a good son once again? Remind Daddy-O who his favorite is? Why are you drinking more? What happened? Tell me. Bronc rotated around and jogged for the truck, jumping behind the wheel. Brand ran for the passenger side and barely made it in before Bronc had the engine fired up and was peeling out toward the south end of the ranch along the borrow pit. Hanging on to the dash with one hand and door frame with the other, Brand secured himself the best he could. They'd been here before, too, Bronc driving in a fury, in control but seeing red. Brand shut up. Their dust cloud plumed over the stubble from the recent harvest. But as soon as they made it to the small levee at the back, Bronc slammed on the brakes and skidded the last few feet to the levee, then was out of the truck so fast Brand's head spun. Jumping out onto corn stubble, Brand watched as Bronc scaled the levee to where it flattened on top. He stood at the top, both hands gripping his belt at his side, his powerful legs locked in a stance that reminded Brand of a Roman gladiator. He waited and waited. Finally, Bronc's shoulders slumped some. Then Brand knew it was over. He'd talk now. His brother slowly turned toward him and slid on one heel after the other back down the levee until they were face to face. You ready to talk about it? Brand planted a hand on Bronc's shoulder and squeezed. Bronc let out the longest, most pent-up breath he'd heard in a long time. It's my fault. Brand slid his hand around Bronc's neck and yanked on him, getting him to move toward the truck. Letting down the tailgate, they sat, both staring at the ground in front of them between their legs. What's your fault? Just then, the roar of an engine brought their heads up to see a pickup truck racing toward them as if it were another Bronc at the wheel. Bronc jumped down and strode forward, biting his bottom lip while he walked. Same thing Brand did when distressed. Bronc obviously knew something Brand didn't. Who's that? Brand asked. Shell. And sure enough, Shell slid to a stop the same way Bronc had, thrust the door open and jumped out. Bronc was there to face her, peering down into her eyes. What's wrong? There was a look of alarm on Shelley's pretty face, scrunching her dark brows together at the center. Her eyes flashed panic, though she seemed composed otherwise. Something bad had happened. It's Tank. He's fallen again. He won't get up. Bronc growled loudly.
Brainless pain in the...
Alfred went to the bunkhouse to call the vet.
Ah, dang it, Shell. You know Norman won't like that.
Whose tank? Brand asked. Bronc ignored him. Shell responded. Our bull. The one and only. Go on back. Do your thing. I'll pick up Norm and meet you there. The North 40.
West side?
She nodded, and then was gone. Skidding her truck around, creating a circle of dust in her wake. Do your thing? Brand wondered about that statement, but figured he'd find out soon enough. Bronc and Brand leapt into their own truck and were on her bumper within seconds. How do you know he's on the west side? Brand asked. Favorite place? There's an oak tree there. He hogs the shade. One side of Bronc's lip twisted up. Male dominance. The ladies don't stand a chance, unless he's in the mood. Brand barked a laugh. What do you suppose happened? He's not very sure-footed. He's an amazing breeder bull, but can't walk to save his life any other time. Probably stepped in a hole. He needs to be nearsighted, but we think he must only be heifer-sighted. Brand laughed. This Bronc seemed more grounded, more mature than when he left for California last year. It made the Jekyll and Hyde whiplash that much more obvious. Bronc peeled off of Shell's bumper to stop at the house. He was out the door without a word. 2 minutes later, he had Norman in his arms and was carrying him toward Brand's side of the truck. Granted, Norman was a small man, but how in the world his alcohol-weakened brother could carry a grown man this easily astonished Brand. He must have been doing this for Norman for the last 10 months to have built up that kind of muscle mass. Brand scooted to the center.
Let's go, Norman said.
Bronc hopped in and sped down the road, slowing only when they came abreast of the fields not yet harvested. A glance toward the safflower on the left showed their father in a harvester, slowly moving his way down a row. To the right was another harvester, cutting and scooping up milo as it crept along. Another few hundred feet, and they came upon alfalfa on both sides, green and ready to harvest again. Bronc must have noticed Brand's focus on the fields. He said, "This will be the fourth and last cutting of the year. It's been a good yield. Last year was dismal for all the crops." Brand figured as much. That was when Norman fell off the tractor onto the disc. It was a tragic year for all Harper West. Brand stole a glance at Norman's injured leg. Even through his pants, Brand could tell the man's leg was shrunken. Norman just looked out of the windshield, eyes fixed on the oak tree far ahead. Brand tipped his chin up toward Bronc. "So, do you like ranching or farming best?" He was surprised when Norman spoke on Bronc's behalf.
Thought he'd never get it last year. His father neither. Of course, there was only one more cutting of alfalfa left when they showed up late summer. Done right well this year. I'll make farmers out of 'em yet.
He grinned, reaching around Brand to give his brother a couple of pats on the shoulder. As they topped the levee between the ranch and the North 40, Brand noticed 2 more trucks and 4 men surrounding the bull, who was flailing wildly on his side. Bronc took them across the field and nosed the pickup to the group. He exited and circled the back bumper for the passenger side. Norman was already on his feet, leaning against the seat. "Hold on, Norm." Bronc whisked Norman up, the older man using his arm strength on the doorframe to help hoist himself up. "Move aside," Bronc barked at the crowd of onlookers, then set Norman down, holding him upright. Alfred took one look at Norman and said, "Vet comin'?"
"Dang it, Alfred. Told you to come get me first."
"Lo siento, senor." Tank stopped flailing, sides heaving, and bellowed. Norman's scowl fell off.
"No need to apologize. It wouldn't hurt for him to check Tank over."
He waved at the gopher hole nearest Tank's hooves.
"This the hole that cast him?"
Alfred nodded. Si, senor. The gopher hole was so churned up now it looked like a mortar impact. Norman cursed.
When's that bull gonna learn to look where he's going? If he weren't so dang fertile, I'd send him to the slaughterhouse.
The crowd chuckled in unison, except for Shelley. Don't say that in front of him. Norman gestured to her that he wasn't about to follow through on the threat. Has he done this a lot? Brand asked Bronc from behind. Bronc turned his head so his brother could see, and dramatically rolled his eyes. Tank started to paddle and strike the ground with his hooves again, trying to get purchase.
Back up,
Norman barked to the surrounding crowd.
You know how riled he gets when you're all hanging over him. Shelley!
The pretty brunette came forward and carefully bent her knees until they were in the soft dirt next to Tank's head. The bull stilled as soon as he saw her. She reached out and stroked his head, then scratched him between the eyes while she mumbled sweet phrases no one could quite make out. His eyes went half-mast. He sighed. Well, by darn, if Brand hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he'd never have believed it. The big fellow was smitten. He couldn't blame the bull. He was surprised Bronc hadn't become smitten with her in the 10 months he'd been there. Norman dropped back down on a good knee, keeping his bad leg straight. Using one of Bronc's legs as a pole, he leaned in and carefully checked the bull's stocky legs one by one. Tank let him, not moving a muscle, as if he knew to be still under Norman's touch. Brand noticed his brother followed along obediently, so Norman could use him as support. He'd never actually seen Bronc do something like this for someone before, though he'd heard from people that he did. Brand often wondered why he never wanted his family to see his benevolent side.
Well,
Norman puffed, getting to his feet.
Nothing's broken, at least.
Before anyone could speculate further, a big white pickup, loaded with a vet pack, drove onto the property and straight up to them. A thin man, older and balding, jumped out and jogged toward the group.
"Tank do it again?"
he said, like this was an everyday occurrence. They all nodded around grins and chuckles. The vet's eyes rested on Shell.
"We already talked about this. Just send Shelley in first and nobody else needs to be bothered. This bull's mighty keen on her. Never seen anything like it."
The vet grinned, then caught sight of Brand and Bronc.
"Whoa, am I seeing double?"
Bronc gestured toward him. "This my twin brother, Brand."
"Ah, is that so? Welcome to Harper Ranch West, son. Name's Wayne Cabot. Good to meet you."
"Well, good to meet you, too." Brand clasped the man's hand in a firm handshake and liked him immediately. Norman interrupted.
"Yeah, I reminded Alfred not to call you first in the future. I think he gets it now. Isn't that right, Alfred?"
"Si, Senor Norman." Brand tapped Bronc on the shoulder. "Is he really saying what I think he's saying? That the dang bull wants to put Shelley on his dance card?" "Yeah, that's what he's saying." Brand threw his head back with a gut-splitting laugh. "I can't believe it. He can't be smart enough to pull something like that off. He's a manipulator of the worst sort. We always check, though. He did have a pretty bad sprain one time." Dr. Cabot squatted.
"Well, since I'm here, may as well check him, just to be sure."
He started with the claws on the right front hoof and worked up. Brand watched idly and laughed some more. It felt good to let loose, especially beside Bronc. "So, he's faking to get Shelley's attention." "Yep. Well, he does step into holes and fall sometimes, but until she's there, he won't get up. Watch." The vet finished his exam, easing the left hind leg through each joint range of motion. Dr. Cabot just shook his head and squinted at Brand.
"You know the last time I was able to do this kind of orthopedic exam on a bull? Other than Tank here?"
Brand shook his head.
"Never. Never in a million years."
Brand wouldn't have believed it had the critter not looked content to just lay there while Shelley scratched and petted his face. Of course, Brand would pretend to be stuck on his side if he got the same treatment. The girl was wholesome and attractive, not in the same way Julia was, but this one looked athletic, confident, earthy. There was a lot to like about that. Once Dr. Cabot finished checking Tank over and found no injury, he backed out of the way. In fact, all the men stepped back. "Up you go, big guy. You can do it," Shelley crooned as she tugged on one of his ears. Apparently this was the key to getting him to rise, since he methodically tugged each leg close to his body and heaved himself to his sternum. "Come on, boy. One more time." Without touching him this time, she moved a couple of yards away and watched as he hefted himself up the rest of the way. His coat quivered, but he never took his eyes off Shelley. The men all scattered, knowing he was still capable of charging any one of them. Brand chuckled, standing with Bronc, observing all the men heading back to work. I would have never believed it had I not seen it with my own eyes. "Righto. Why do the men all show up? To help lift him if need be?" Bronc laughed and winked at Shell. She ducked her head, but a small grin rose to the corner of her pretty mouth, and a flush filled her face. "Heck no. They all want to watch Shell here sweet-talk the big guy. Makes their day more interesting." Brand remembered Tank's flailing panic, but let the comment stand. Crazy. He eyed the interaction between the pretty cowhand and his brother. Here they'd been working on Harper Ranch West for 10 months, and nothing had ever come of it. There had to be a story here. "Can we help you in any way?" Brand asked Shelley. She jerked her head up, the slight pink still covering her cheeks. "No, I got it." She grinned up at Brand, making his heart skip. "Tank here is a real pussycat." She continued to scratch him between the ears. "Aren't you, big guy?" "Is he really that docile?" Bronc cursed, then laughed. "No. Let's get out of here while the getting's good." Brand looked unconvinced. Bronc gave Brand a shove toward the pickup. Brand looked back at a completely controlled Angus bull with a cowhand, all woman, pulling the old fool by the ear toward his favorite tree. Now he'd seen everything. Chapter 6. 9 hours and 15 minutes later, by Brand's watch, his twin and he had showered, shaved, and eaten supper with family and co-workers. The rest of their Saturday had been pretty uneventful. Bronc made one last trip to clear the dishes and headed for the door without a word. Brand, having been warned ahead of time to watch for the disappearance act, gave Cord a quick wave and then jogged after Bronc. Bronc was hoisting himself behind the wheel and looked surprised when Brand flew around the front bumper and jumped into the passenger side. "What are you doing?" "Going with you, wherever that might be." "Why?" "Go rest. You must be tired after your first day. I'll see you in the morning." "No, I'm going with you." Realizing his voice was too stern, he lightened up. He couldn't get Bronc angry about being babysat again. "I just got here, dear brother, and here you were trying to get rid of me." Bronc groaned. "Fine, but don't be a nag." Brand grinned at him, and Bronc only groaned again back. Brand recognized landmarks this time along the way to Al the Wop's. Bronc parked in the same spot as last night, then both donned their hats and exited the truck. They pushed their way in, towering over the heads to peruse the crowd. The jukebox blared, and people were boogieing on the makeshift dance floor. They slid onto 2 bar stools at the bar. Bronc leaned in to shout into Brand's ear. "This dang birthday party started a bad trend. Used to be we could just come and drink, not be bothered by this mayhem." Brand was grinning, surveying the crowd of beautiful women dancing in groups. It was his turn to lean into Bronc's ear.
"Looks to have more women than men in this part of the country."
Brand's smile broadened.
"Sorry, I haven't been with you. Bet you been needing me to help you with your game."
Bronc rolled his eyes and raised one finger to Marco behind the bar. The cold pint no sooner hit the bar top than it was at Bronc's lips and downed. Bronc was halfway through the second when his mood started to lighten. Brand eyed him, worrying that Bronc was just getting started.
"Do you come here every night?"
Bronc made a face and shook his head. "Good. At least this wasn't a nightly ritual."
"I go to Wimpy's or Justy's sometimes. Sometimes I go into Lodi. It depends."
A sour taste accompanied the dread.
"On what?"
Bronc raised his chin.
"On how drunk I plan to get.
Not how much I planned to drink." What was going on with his brother? According to his dad, Bronc's drinking had gotten especially bad about a month ago. A lot had been happening on the Bar 6, but it seemed things were under control here at Harper West. Why had Bronc escalated? After 4 pints of beer, Bronc shifted to whiskey shots, smooth-talking everyone who got near him. Brand settled in to study him. Bronc had his Mr. Charming hat on for most of the evening, but now he was merely bowed over the drink of choice, shoulders slumped, head bent, and when he looked up at Brand on a rare occasion, there was something new riding his eyes beside a boozy glaze. If Brand had to guess, it was worry, or sadness, or maybe guilt. One thing he knew for sure. Something wasn't right with his party animal partner. Bronc rubbed the heel of his hand over his eyes and barked about the music being too loud, the dancing being too much. Back in Wyoming, drinking had only been a fun addition to a Cooper night on the town. Looking at Bronc now, Brand's heart sank. He'd taken a gamble, calling Bronc an alcoholic today. But seeing him hung over his bottle, Brand knew he was right. Something had caused the shift. Bronc burped, then scratched his cheek with slow, shaky fingers. Brand took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He was about to put a stop to the next round, still sipping his first beer, when Bronc leaned in to shout toward his ear.
"Let's get smir."
Bronc nodded, relieved, and they both slid off the bar stools. Bronc staggered in place, but he caught himself on the stool, hanging on until he gained his equilibrium and stopped bobbling. Finally, he put one foot in front of the other, and they found themselves on the other side of the bar door.
"Over here,"
Bronc said, as he tottered toward a small alleyway. When he reached the opening, he twisted around the corner and banged his back up against wood slats. He widened his legs to brace himself against the building and reached into his pocket for a pack of Marlboros. "Since when have you taken up smoking?" Bronc snorted.
"I do all the bad boy things, brother. You know that?"
The one beer Brand had was fermenting in his stomach. "What's up?"
"What do you mean?"
He fumbled with the pack, nearly losing it twice before he wrestled it under control. He threw a white cigarette toward his mouth, trying to catch it in his lips, but it bounced off and hit the dirt. He laughed and took out another. This time he caught it, then grinned around the dangling thing. "I mean, this is not like you, Bronco. You're a partier, all right, but not a sloppy drunk or a smoker. Want to tell me what's going on with you?" Bronc got a faraway look in his eyes, as if something was playing on the screen in his mind. His grin vanished, and a deep frown took over, drawing his brows together. "Bronc?"
"Nothing."
"You can't BS me, brother. We have the same brain, remember? Spill." Brand expected another laugh out of him, but got a scowl instead.
"No way we have the same brain, brother. I may have to put up with looking exactly like you, but I don't think like you. Not ever. You'll never find me second annihilate psycho.
His face lit up with a sloppy smile.
Remember that movie?
What a gas. You're wasted.
Not yet. Going back inside to finish the job.
He pushed off the wall, staggered 2 steps, then gained his legs. Losing his patience, Brand reached him and slammed him back into place. No, you're not. How do you function at the ranch the day after you're so soused? Gotten anybody hurt yet? That above all else enraged him. This Bronc wasn't safe for anyone to be around. Why do you do it? You used to know when enough was enough. Tell me what was going on with you, now. Bronc tried to move again, but Brand moved his hand from Bronc's chest to his collar, twisted it, and knocked him back into place again. You are not going back inside. No more booze.
You're a dang party pooper, pooper.
Another drunken laugh split from him.
Pooper Scooper.
He laughed at his own goof, slipping down the building as his legs gave out. Brand sneered, disgusted as he yanked him upright. Oh, you think you're so funny. He held Bronc in place, staring straight into his hazel eyes, just like his own. You may as well tell me. I'm going to find out if I have to beat it out of you. Bronc flung Brand's arm off with a steel grip. The power behind the thrust surprised Brand. They were now in a staring contest. If Brand didn't know better, he'd think Bronc hadn't had a drop, as solid as his stare was. The first one to speak would lose. That had been their code for as long as he could remember. It was usually Bronc who caved. So, Brand waited and watched, face to face. Brand had the dizzy sense of staring at himself in a mirror. He remembered when they used to dupe people in high school. Brand would turn up, do an assignment for Bronc, then run into his own class. He'd served many a detention for showing up late to class to save his brother's grades. All because Bronc was too wild to settle down and concentrate. Now Bronc's dark circles and bloodshot eyes set him apart, along with the wiry build that stole his vigor, if not his raw strength. Beat it out of me? Bronc spoke first, as Brand knew he would. Good luck with that, you wimp. Oh, wimpies. I'm hungry. Bronc took a step forward and nearly toppled into Brand. Brand straightened him again. Let's go home. Dig up some leftovers.
No, it's only 10. Let's go get a burger. I can only pay you Tuesday for the hamburger today,
Bronc said on a burbled laugh. Brand grinned, then sighed. Fine, Popeye, but I'm driving. He reached in and dug the keys out of Bronc's pocket. Bronc flexed his bicep, then dropped his arm to his side.
Wait. No, not Popeye. Wimpy!
Brand waved off the comment, then grabbed him around the waist and slung Bronc's arm over his shoulders. A burger might sober him up, along with a pot of hot coffee. Brand worried Bronc wouldn't get the directions right, but as it turned out, Wimpy's was just down the street, around a bend, and to the left after a small bridge. It took a bit to get his drunk brother into the restaurant and up to the counter. Brand figured he could wedge him between the counter and the permanent stool to hold him in place. Worked pretty well, even though he looked like a gorilla stuffed in a high chair. Thankfully, Bronc didn't seem to notice. He was already hollering his order of 2 hamburgers that he'd pay for on Tuesday. Brand groaned. After about 15 minutes, an old cook with a battered chef's hat and significant paunch came around from the back, carrying 2 plates of hamburgers and french fries. Apparently, the waitress was gone for the night.
Here you go, boys.
He plunked down the burgers. Then, seeing Bronc's condition, he poured them 2 cups of coffee.
Never told me you had a twin, Bronco? How'd you manage to duplicate yourself like that? Amazing.
Yeah, we're amazing. Bronc elbowed Brand. Are we, bro? Meet Tony. Nice to meet you, Tony. You own the place?
Nah, just the cook.
Laughter floated on the air just before a group of young ladies came through the side entrance. The last girl shut out the dark night with the closing click of the door. Bronc and Brand craned their necks to check out the party of women. By the look on Bronc's face, he spotted the same girl Brand did. Polka Dot. Only today she was in a pair of lavender Bermuda shorts with a white sleeveless blouse tucked in, exposing her long, shapely legs. A sweater was held up by her shoulders. Julia. She was a true beauty. Bronc tried to stand, but was too drunk and too wedged into the seat. Brand did the honors, sucking in his stomach and easily slipping out of his stool. Evening, ladies. He tipped his hat, warming to the challenge ahead. Can I find you a table? With no one else around except the loudmouths at the bar area 1 room over, Brand took this opportunity to become their waiter. Here, let me put a couple tables together for you. You here for food or just drinks? Julia came forward, still the spokesperson for the group of 6, a sparkling smile on her beautiful face. Brand's heart somersaulted. Hi, Brand. Long time no see. Brand gave her a wide Cooper smile and nodded. What are the chances? She spread her arms wide. In this sprawling metropolis? It's uncanny. Her gaze landed on Bronc, and Brand could see the pity on her face. He snorted, feeling disgusted with his brother all over again. Bronc was squirming, trying to get unstuck, but finally gave up and turned toward them the best he could. His smile was lopsided, his eyes red and droopy. He finally got himself turned enough to address them. Good to see you, delicious creatures. His eyes swept up and down Julia's body in a tactless gesture. Brand seethed. Whatever pity he was feeling toward Bronc quickly evaporated in a swell of anger. They'd grown up on a beautiful ranch. They had brothers and a father who cared. He knew Bronc had never come to terms with the way their mother had died, exasperated by a busy father. But come on. Bronc needed to face his past and grow up. Brand wanted nothing more than to stuff his brother in the truck, to sleep it off, and enjoy Julia's company alone. Bronc, he spat, reaching to grab him out of the chair. Julia put a hand on Brand's wrist, stopping him gently. He focused on that hand, the way her slender hands couldn't quite wrap around his wrist, with those perfectly shaped nails painted pale pink, looking soft and delicate. The touch alone had him spiraling. When finally he forced his eyes up to gaze into the most striking azure eyes, her lips parted, giving him ideas he shouldn't allow himself to have. No, leave him be, she pleaded. Let him eat and have his coffee. It will help. Why don't you join us? She smiled, a sweet smile, and Brand could do nothing more than stare. The girls giggled. Julia shook his arm. Come. Sure. He let loose of Bronc as if he were a bag of refuge and glanced around their table. First, let me take your orders. He rearranged their table for them, inviting them to sit, then stood back, pushing his sleeves up his arms even as the cuffs flopped back down. Don't make it too complicated. Not sure I'll remember it all. He grinned. Julia grinned back. How about 6 chocolate milkshakes? Can you remember that? 5, a bigger girl said as she stared at the table with a grim look on her face. He reached back in his memory for her name. Why, Rose? Doesn't Julia want one? He hated it. when people saw themselves as lesser than they were. Rose's chin snapped up as she caught and stared into his eyes with tears in her own. "You remember my name?" "Well, of course. You don't think you're memorable?" "Well, I'll get 6 milkshakes. I'm having coffee." "But that means," Rose said, not finishing her sentence. "That means Polka Dot wants one, I guess." He grinned and winked at Julia. Julia's smile was like a ray of sunshine that forced her radiant blue eyes into a twinkling squint. She winked back. Brand's heart did a jig, then tripped headlong into the mud. Oh, right. Bronc wanted her. Chapter 7. Julia's breath fluttered like a quivering leaf on the breeze. Brand was a magnificent man, toned, tall, tanned, and now she added something more important, thoughtful. The man's kindness showed, and that went farther in Julia's book than any physical attribute could. Though it certainly didn't hurt that he was easy on the eyes, which was doubled due to his identical twin. They looked exactly alike, but were miles apart in personality, behavior, and attitude from what she'd observed so far. Brand drew her in ways only Galatians 5:23 in the Bible could explain. He exhibited many of the 9 fruits of the Spirit. She ticked them off in her head, as she'd done several times since meeting Brand last night. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. She didn't know him well enough yet to know if he had all of them, but she knew for certain he had already shown patience, kindness, gentleness, and self-control. None of them would be easy without God, she figured, which made her pretty excited. She figured Brand must have a relationship with the Almighty. Of course, she would have to find out. She knew better than to pursue someone who didn't place themselves under the same ultimate authority as she did. She never wanted to slide into a marriage unequally yoked. All that meant was heartache for both the believer and the unbeliever. Having the same faith was too important not to get right. Wow, when had her thoughts ever taken her to marriage before? Her Bible, her friends, her church, those were the things that should take her time. And now the new ministry she had developed with her church's sponsorship, a recovery home for alcoholics, was scooping up the rest of her time. As well it should. She needed to remember where her priorities lay, and why. She worked hard for this outcome, and a lot more work was still to come. Her thoughts drifted back to Brand. Truth be told, she knew full well when the thought of marriage had first crossed her mind. It was the moment she saw Brand saving his brother from that fight last night. The twins were handsome, or rather male perfection in her book, but Brand's good heart captured her attention. It wasn't often she found both qualities in a man. Sadly, in the last several years, the men at her church wore attributes like a thin armor in order to enlist the interest of the Christian girls. She knew better, spent time in her Bible, so she knew how to look for the real thing, for a man who truly loved God. So far, not one man had passed one of her most important tests, treating her friend Rose with kindness. Not until Brand. "So, I don't know how to make your milkshakes, but I'll be sure to give Tony your order. Is that fair?" Brand's beautiful eyes, a sparkling green tonight, looked to her for confirmation. "Fair enough," she said, then grinned at him. His answering smile ignited her from the inside at the sheer splendor of it. What a shame his twin didn't seem to have the same heart. But wait, that wasn't fair. All she knew about Bronc, so far, was that alcohol seemed to control his behavior. He needed prayer and help, not judgment. Brand turned on his heel and headed to the kitchen through a swinging door. Soon the cook joined him in the front. He set up 3 large silver containers and began dishing in vanilla ice cream, milk, and chocolate sauce, then slid each one up the milkshake machine until it clicked in place.
I want one.
Bronc grinned at Tony with the same smile Brand had given to Julia, only it ended up lopsided from his inebriation.
Sure, Tony said. Why don't you drink your coffee first, buddy?
Julia watched with quiet appreciation. Bronc had clearly spent some time here at Wimpy's, and Tony's simple decency was well placed tonight. She relished the peacefulness of the dining area right now. Even if Wimpy's was sort of a hole in the wall, it was right on the delta, with windows along the west side of the building overlooking the dock and moored boats. It was a zoo during the weekend daytime hours, so she and her friends loved coming here at this time of night. Other than the bar that was always hopping, it was blissfully quiet for a Saturday night. The milkshake machine stopped, and Tony took the silver containers down one by one to pour them into tall glasses.
Here you go, Tony said to Brand. There was leftover milkshake, so you can have it for being my waitress tonight. You pretty little thing, you.
He winked at Brand, chuckling all the way back to the kitchen. Ha ha, very funny. Sliding the shake in front of his brother, Brand said, Drink your coffee first, then you can have your dessert. Then he proceeded to Julia and her friends to deliver the rest. Going back to behind the counter, where he must have seen Tony grab silverware, he retrieved tall spoons, refilled his coffee cup, and brought it all back, handing a spoon to Rose first, then to each of the rest of them. They all thanked him while he pulled up a chair and sat backwards facing the girls and the large bank of windows, coffee cup in hand. "You haven't even eaten your hamburger yet," Julia said, pointing behind him to the counter where Bronc sat all alone, drinking coffee as he was instructed to do. That surprised her. Bronc didn't seem the submissive type to her, but she guessed they had their routine figured out on nights that Bronc drank. She leaned in close to Brand. He met her halfway. "You can invite your brother over here, you know. It's kind of rude to leave him there all alone." He whispered back to her. "He's kind of rude being this tanked, so I think I'll leave him right where he is. Teach him a lesson." Then he chuckled, a deep, husky sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Oh, are you in charge of him?" His eyes widened. "What? No, sorry. That sounded all wrong." She began to laugh. He narrowed his eyes. "I'm just teasing." Though drunkenness wasn't a laughing matter, she knew too well. "But still, you take very good care of him. Do you have to do this often?" His lips drooped at the outer corners. Her heart went out to him. He seemed to be contemplating how much to say, and finally he said, "More than I want to admit." "You're from Wyoming, right?" Brand's eyebrows went up. "You clairvoyant or something?" She laughed. "No. Bronc told us as much last night. What brings you here?" "Bronc came with my dad 10 months ago. They've been helping my dad's father-in-law on the farm. He'd been injured. I just arrived yesterday." She wanted to ask what happened, and why he'd just arrived, and why he didn't use the term "my grandfather," but decided it was really none of her business. Julia glanced at her friends, who were busy slurping and giggling amongst themselves. Even in a crowd, it seemed that she and Brand were the only 2 people in the room. She studied Brand's eyes, which looked like warm caramel under the lamplight. His kindness called to her, and she leapt before she could talk herself out of it. "Why are you 2 so different? Why are you the solid brother?" His brows knit together. Interesting way of putting that. He rolled his lip in, as he seemed to be thinking over his next words. "You'd be surprised how solid my brother is when he's not drinking." She'd expected the conversation to tack toward what made Brand tick, but the tingle down her back told her the Lord had bigger things in mind. "How so?" Brand looked at Bronc, his expression pained and tender at the same time. "He's intense, and a ridiculously hard worker. There's a lot going on in that head of his, too. It takes time for him to open up, but once he trusts you, he'll have your back, no matter what." Julie sat upright, surprised to hear such high praise. Brand turned back to her and shrugged. "He's always pushed boundaries, lived on the wild side. I think it's because he doesn't want to settle for the mundane." Brand's attention flicked to the rest of the girls around the table. "But he's no good in a crowd, so he drinks. Truth is, he'd be appalled if he saw a film of himself while he's drinking. He doesn't think he drinks too much. He drinks because he thinks he's charming, and people like him better when he does." Julie was seeing Bronc with new eyes, but the disconnect was still too much to take in. "Charming?" "Well, that was him in Sundance. Here," Brand cleared his throat, "I've never seen him this bad before." The words rang in her head. She scrunched the napkin in her hand, unaware of her death grip on it, until she felt the ache in her fingers. She pressed her palms flat on the table in front of her. The new recovery program she designed was never far from her mind. It could help him, but Bronc would have to want to go. Julia debated whether to bring it up this soon. She should probably get to know Brand better first. The girls always warned her about this. You wouldn't have recognized him at work today. But after 3 hours at Al's bar, Brand tipped his chin toward the haggard lump wedged into place at the counter. "You drink too much, too?" "Did it once. Never again." "So, you can decide when to quit, and you do." She took a breath and couldn't seem to stop the flow of thoughts coming out of her mouth. "The alcoholic thinks the first drink is good. The idea of a second and third even better, and they keep going until they pass out, someone stops them, or they stumble out in front of a car." She stopped, swallowed to dislodge the lump in her throat. "Alcoholism is a mental illness and emotional issue, not just physical." Brand blinked at her while holding his cup halfway to his mouth. He dropped the cup back to the table with a thump and licked his lips. "How do you know so much about this? Are you an alcoholic?" "No. I lost someone. She took a breath, remembering her promise to herself to not bring up her brother to strangers without a proper introduction into the subject. Looking into Brand's mesmerizing eyes, she debated. Sadly, not long enough. Then opened her mouth to go for it. He needed the information, didn't he? He had a brother in serious trouble. "My church is running a recovery program for alcoholics and drug addicts." At least she wouldn't tell him she had been the driving force behind it. It was unorthodox for a woman to be so involved in men's addictions, especially since women had to suffer the same addictions. Women just happened to be better at hiding it. "Having the church help is frowned upon. Most people think doctors and mental hospitals should handle addicts. But we think God is the answer, and our program is proving that." Brand looked down into his cup, picked it up, and emptied it in one gulp. Julia had a bad feeling about this. "Be careful. Did you burn your mouth?" "I'm fine." Brand grabbed the napkin out of the tin in the middle of the table and wiped his mouth. "Gotta go. Get my brother home. We have a big day tomorrow." He bounced off the chair and swiveled it back under the table so fast it made Julia dizzy. "Did I say something wrong?" Brand ignored her question. He looked over his shoulder for his brother and found an empty stool with one hamburger gone and half of another, and most of the coffee left on the counter. The milkshake wasn't touched. He glared at the group of ladies as if they'd failed in their babysitting job. "Where's Bronc?" Rose grimaced apologetically and pointed in the direction of the bar. Brand dropped his chin to his chest, squeezed his eyes closed as his nostrils flared with a lungful of breath. When he lifted his head, Brand made eye contact with each girl at the table, and her last of all. "Thank you for the company, ladies. I hope your milkshakes were enjoyable." He tipped his hat at the group, dropped a $5 bill down on the counter, and spun toward the bar, and was gone. "Wow, what did you say to him?" Rose demanded. Julia pressed her lips together, feeling ashamed. "You didn't." Julia nodded. Rose glowered at her. "God talk or church talk?" Lips still pressed together, Julia shook her head. "No?" She looked puzzled until her eyes widened with understanding. "You didn't. Your recovery program?" Julia twisted her mouth and nodded again. Rose groaned loudly. "Oh, you promised you weren't going to hit people between the eyes with the program. Invite, Julia. Invite people to a program that can help them. You can't badger them into coming. Is that what you did?" She glanced in the direction of the bar and whispered, "His brother is obviously an alcoholic. He needs to know about it." The whole group grumbled in unison. Her friend Lynn shook her head. "I understand your passion, Julia. But didn't your dad say we have to tread lightly? This is a new concept in our area, and you don't even know if he believes in God, do you? Shouldn't you have gotten to know him first, so he wouldn't run away? Like he just did?" Julia groaned. "I know. There's just such a need there. What am I supposed to do?" "Good question," her redhead friend Karen said. "When will you see him again?" "I don't know." "Next time, if you have the next time, invite him to church. First things first," Rose said. Brand was shaken to the core. He'd allowed himself to like Julia, really like her, quite a lot, even going against his own rule not to have an interest in the same girl as his twin. Bah! Now he'd shown his hand a little too much, given her an opening to drag him to church, of all places. Well, he wouldn't go. He'd pride himself on being the only Cooper male who was legitimately grounded, the only one who didn't need to lean on God. As he stepped into the dimly lit room, the bar sounds hit him. The din of music and laughter usually didn't bother him, but tonight it outright suffocated him. He strode up to Bronc. "Why are you in here?" Bronc turned in his seat, a drained shot of whiskey in hand, and grinned. "There you are." Turning back to the gathering of men at his other side, he jabbed his thumb over his shoulder. "See? What'd I tell ya?" "Concern it," the old codger said, slapping a hand on the bar. "Will you look at that? I've known you near on a year, and now I'm seeing double." "Nope," Bronc grinned, setting his glass down with a thunk. "This is my twin brother, Brand." He grinned some more. "You owe me a drink, old-timer." "Son of a—" The bartender laughed, slapped whiskey into a new glass, and slid it toward Bronc. The old man raised his glass as if to bump Bronc's new tumbler with his, but Bronc didn't pick up on it fast enough before the geezer swigged the rest of his own whiskey down. "Bartender, guess I'm paying for that double." Brand stepped between the two. "No, I'm taking him home. Rain check?" The bartender busied himself drying shot glasses. "Take it now or not at all?" Brand glanced at the bartender, took the shot out of Bronc's fingers, and downed it himself. The liquid burned straight down his esophagus like he'd just swallowed gasoline. He coughed once, then grabbed his brother by the collar, lifting him to his feet. "Hey, stop it! Let go!" Bronc wobbled on his feet, trying his best to pull out of Brand's grip. "We're going. You're going. Now." The whole crew at the bar had stopped their drinking to watch, hoping to see a fight, no doubt. Heat climbed Brand's neck. He wanted to be anywhere but here. He dragged his brother toward the door, hoping the girls weren't still there to witness this. They were gone, thankfully. Hearing the scuffle, Tony barreled through the door from the kitchen, not looking a bit surprised.
"Need help? I usually have to drive him home."
Brand stilled just as he was about to step out the door and swung them both to face Tony. "What are you talking about? He's done this before?" Tony looked sad and a bit sheepish.
"I figured Shelley would have told you."
"Shelley? What does Shelley have to do with this?"
"Why, well, it's like this. When Bronc comes in here drinking, I can't just put him in his truck to drive home. I drive him. But I figured your dad or Norm wouldn't be happy. Bronc's a good kid. I don't want him to get in trouble. So the first time I took him home, Shelley met me at the front gate with her pickup. She took over from there."
"Well, how late was she out there?"
"About 2 a.m.
"She was waiting at 2 a.m. on the ranch road?" Brand felt like he was about to explode. Bronc started to slide to the floor, but Brand yanked him back up. "How many times have you had to do this, Tony?" Tony shuffled his feet and looked at the floor. "Tony?" Finally, the older man looked up.
"Often."
"Often like once a month, or often like every night?" He waved a hand through the air.
"Oh, no, not every night."
The black coffee was stirring in Brand's stomach, about to come up. This was why their dad wanted Brand here. "How many nights a week, Tony?"
"Oh, I don't know. 2, maybe 3. Not too many."
Brand's hand slipped from Bronc's collar, and this time he almost lost him to the cement landing. He searched frantically for a place to set Bronc down, but before he could direct his twin back inside, Bronc teetered sideways, looking outright green. Brand cursed, and Tony moved. They got Bronc down the cement slope and out to the weeds where Bronc lost his late supper, and Brand nearly followed. Once the heaving stopped, Brand rocked Bronc to a clean spot and let him sag to his knees. Bronc managed to look up into his brother's face and smirk.
"Thanks," Bronc slurred.
Then his eyes rolled back, and he slumped to the right, banging his cheek into the cement at the bottom of the ramp. Brand removed his hat, scrubbed a hand down his face, then stuffed it back on, landing his gaze on Tony. "Okay, Tony, tell me what you know." Tony started to hem and haw again, but saw the glare. "Fine." He untied the knot in the front of his apron, then unwound it from his body and threw it over the railing. "When Bronc first got into town, he'd come in for a burger and fries. We'd talk. He's a solid guy, your brother." A snore, then snort. Then another snore came from the passed-out Bronc. Both men looked his way to see he was sound asleep. Brand stretched his back, then wandered off a few paces. Tony followed. "Yeah, I know he's a good guy. I am him, he is me. So much alike it makes me crazy, but so different in this." Tony scratched his rough cheek, considering this. "Yeah, he and I talked some, those early days. When he did drink, it was because he was ticked your father forced him to come out west. But then Norman and he became close, and Bronc seemed more settled, more comfortable in his skin. He still drank, but I didn't see him drunk for quite a while. You do know you're not the only establishment he drinks at?" Tony nodded. "But he usually lands here last. He knows I'll drive him if he gets drunk. Well, the thing is, about a month ago he started ramping up the booze. Went to whiskey shots mostly. He's worried me ever since. Shelley, too." "Why do you think he's doing it?"
"Dunno. Something happened.
Yeah, something. But what? Brand sighed out of frustration. I'll check out the workers at Harper West. Maybe he did something he's not proud of. Brand ran a hand down his face. So about Shelley. Why in the world does she wait up for him until wee hours of the morning? Tony smiled.
Well, son, in my estimation, there's only one reason a filly would do that.
Brand scrunched up his face. Don't tell me she's interested in him? Tony shrugged.
Why not? He's a good-looking kid. Upstanding guy, most of the time.
But she has to scrape him off her truck seat every night and put him to bed. Now, speaking of which, how does she get him to bed?
Don't think she does.
What do you mean? Tony shrugged again. You saying she lets him sleep it off in her truck? Where? How does she get home?
I only caught them once. I'd driven off. Nearly got home when I realized I still had his hat in my car. A cowboy can't be without his hat, you know. And how would he explain that to his dad or Norm the next day? So I drove it back. Took about a half hour, I suspect. And her truck was parked in that cattle pasture of yours. So I turned off my lights and parked, snuck up to them. Shelley had scooched over to prop him upright in her arms. He was sound asleep, and she was stroking his hair and singing to him.
She was what?
Sweetest sound I ever did hear. An old lullaby. Could have put me to sleep with him right then and there. Made me envious.
Tony grinned as his eyes drifted off. What did you do?
Laid his hat in her truck bed and left. Didn't want to disturb a scene like that. She takes care of him every night that I bring him home. If I had to guess, I'd say she tells her dad she bunks there. What an angel. Then again, she might be just that.
Angels. Much as he hated to think it. Maybe they did exist.
Well, thanks, Tony. I'll be around now to take care of him. We'll be sure to let Shelley know that, or she'll be waiting at the gate every night.
How'd she even know you were bringing him back at that hour?
Guess she was there out of worry the first time. Then someone at the camp must have told her whenever Bronc left the ranch in the evening, because she'd been there every time after that.
Brand nodded, then shook Tony's hand. Well, thank you for taking such good care of him all these months. Anything I can ever do for you?
He's a good man. Never doubt that.
Chapter 8. When Brand drove down the levee into the ranch, sure enough, there was an anxious Shelley, pacing back and forth at the gate. He slowed to a stop and rolled down the window as she ran up to the driver's side, wringing her hands. She was a vision in the moonlight. No longer in cowboy grubs from work, her silky blonde hair shimmered in the light of the full moon. When she looked up at him, he was immediately taken aback by how stunning she was. An obvious tomboy laced with natural beauty. Brand wondered how Bronc had never gotten lost in those eyes. So big now, with worry they looked like black onyx in the night. She started to say something, then bit the corner of her lower lip. Brand found himself staring at those delicate lips, then roused himself. I thought I might find you here. Tony told me how. She looked past Brand to Bronc, conked out against the door panel. Is he all right? Her breathing was short and heavy, her words clipped, as if she might cry. Bronc's fine, really. I put him in the truck myself. Her fingers clasped the window at the door, where Bronc hadn't quite rolled it down all the way. She leaned in. The intensity of her worry hit Brand like a wall of heat. He glanced at Bronc. who was admittedly sprawled between the seat back and door pillar, with his neck crooked at an awkward angle. "Would you like to go around and check for yourself? I'll hold him so he won't fall out." Brand didn't know why he'd offered that. He'd never seen a gal so anxious over Bronc's well-being before. A mix of raw feeling came over him. Happiness, serenity, a touch of jealousy, and a swell of gratitude. Tony had been right. Shelley wouldn't do it if she didn't care deeply for Bronc. Without hesitation, Shelley ran around the front grill to Bronc on the other side. She opened the door so fast that Brand hadn't had a chance to catch hold of Bronc. He caught a fistful of coat sleeve just before Bronc would have tumbled to the ground head first. It jarred Bronc awake. Blinking, he tried to sit up straighter.
"Shell,"
Bronc said with a gravelly voice,
"you're here."
Brand immediately felt like an interloper. The air around them all had thickened, warmed. Bronc and Shelley had stilled, eyes locked to one another's. Time slowed as each one seemed to drink the other in. Shelley reached out a hand to Bronc's face. Brand heard the rasp of his beard against her palm. "Can I help you to my truck?" she asked. Bronc nodded before Brand could respond. "No, not tonight. I'll take him to the cabin and to bed." Realizing his voice sounded harsh, he worked to lighten it. This sweet, supportive woman didn't need more mistreatment. "Shelley, thank you for all you've done for him, but I'll be his keeper from now on. You go on home. Get some rest." Shelley tore her gaze away from Bronc to Brand. Desperation was in her eyes, and it broke Brand's heart. "Oh, no, that won't be necessary, Brand." She searched his eyes. I can do it." He sighed, wishing it could be different. "You don't understand, Shelley. I'm not asking. I'm telling. It's what our dad wants, so it's what I intend to do." Shelley looked stunned. The girl ought to be relieved, but she was anything but. Still, it had to be this way. Brand had a lot of work to do to bring his brother back from the snares of alcoholism. It wouldn't be easy, but he needed to get started right away, and that meant he had to have eyes on him. "Thanks, Shelley. Can you get home all right?" Though he knew she obviously could. "If not, I could follow you." "No, that's not necessary," she said with an edge. She heaved a sigh. "And you are sure you can carry him to the cabin? I would follow you, help with that." No, go on now." He looked pointedly at the gate in her truck. "Thank you for all you've done for Bronc." During the whole exchange, Bronc remained silent, but as soon as Brand dismissed Shelley, Bronc rolled out of the truck and solidly onto his feet. Brand cursed and threw his door open, expecting to have to wrestle his swaying brother back into the truck. Just as he came around the grill and up to the open passenger door, he saw something he'd never expected to see. A tender Bronc. Stunned to silence, Brand could only watch. Bronc had raised both hands to Shelley's face and cupped it so gently it was almost reverent. He leaned down, seemingly sober, though Brand knew he wasn't. Shelley's eyelids closed in anticipation. When Brand thought he'd kiss her, he instead pressed his forehead into hers and breathed her in for a few breaths. It was the most magical moment Brand had ever witnessed. After only seconds, Bronc tilted his head up and kissed her forehead with a lingering kiss. Then he said, "Thank you, Shell, for being such a good friend all these months." When he released her and turned back to the truck seat, Shelley's legs wobbled. Brand moved fast enough to catch her by the arm and steady her. When she looked into his face, he could feel her pain and sadness. Bronc's words had been dismissive, as if he'd never see her again. And Brand guessed that was true. At least, not at 2 in the morning. It wasn't quite dawn, but that was ranch life for you. Brand turned over for the 100th time in the small twin bed, groaning from the aches and pains of the day before. If he was going to work this hard, he'd have to insist on a better bed. Bronc must have done that along the way. His bed was longer and seemed wider. Brand considered drinking right along with Bronc just so he could pass out at night and not feel a thing until morning. He gazed at Bronc, who was lying on his stomach with his face in Brand's direction, drool dribbling from the corner of his mouth. So that's how I look after a night of boozing it up. He snorted. Bronc. No answer. Not even a muscle twitch. Time to get up. Brand swung his legs over the side of the bed, his pajama bottoms riding up on his calves. He scratched at his bare chest as he reached a foot out to nudge Bronc in the arm. Still nothing. He got up, stretched for a minute, then swung around to park himself on Bronc's back.
Hey, get off me!
Bronc bellowed into his pillow. Get up. I'll get you some aspirin and water. It's time for breakfast. Bronc shoved Brand off and turned over.
Since when are you in charge of what we do? Where have you been for the last 10 months?
Bronc moved mechanically as he shifted and sat on the edge of the bed, his head in hands, elbows on his thighs. How do you manage to look such a mess by morning when you seemed dead to the world all night? Brand asked. Bronc hacked and coughed, clearing his throat.
Yeah, what's it to you?
You're a mess.
What? Don't like seeing how you look in the morning?
Brand groaned. He was right. He hoped he was at least less disheveled and less green. Bronc looked about ready to spew yesterday's fixings. You gonna be sick? Brand asked.
No. Leave me be so I can clean up. Wouldn't want to offend the princess.
Brand snorted, started to head outside, but turned back. Do you remember anything about last night? Bronc tilted his head in Brand's direction.
Sure. Went to Al the Wops.
And? His brother's eyes glazed over as he forced his mind into gear.
Oh, right. Pay you Tuesday for a hamburger. Wimpy's.
And?
Nothing. Ate a burger and a milkshake. I can still taste it in every burp.
Classy. What else?
Nothing else. You piled me into bed with all my dang clothes on.
You don't remember anything else?
Like what?
Seriously?
No. What the heck else are you talking about?
Bronc rose and stripped his good jeans off, stuffing one leg in his work pants, then the other. Surprisingly steady. He hiked up and fastened his jeans, then began unbuttoning his rumpled shirt. He turned to face Brand. They glared at each other, waiting to see who would talk first. Always Bronc.
Tell me what else I should be remembering, or I'm going to give you a knuckle sandwich.
Do you remember a special lady? Bronc's eyes wandered.
Oh, yeah. Julia. She was at Wimpy's. Forgot about that. Can't wait to see her again. Did you set up another time for us?
Not Julia.
Well, then who?
Oh, for crying out loud, Bronco. Who was waiting at the ranch to make sure you got home all right? Bronc looked so puzzled. Brand nearly walloped him upside the head.
You're loony, dear brother. I don't remember nothing past Julia and Wimpy's burgers.
Bronc didn't deserve a sweet gal waiting for him into the wee hours of the morning. Brand felt righteous fury swirl in his chest. Do you remember anyone waiting at the gate? Whenever Tony brought you home before, and many times before?
Is that what he told you? Many?
Bronc scoffed, then tossed on an undershirt and flannel over that. While buttoning up, he said, Might remember a time or two when our female cowhand was there to tuck me in.
No one else.
Bronc couldn't even use her name. Brand clenched his jaw with more fury than felt a jolt of shock. Tuck you in? She brought you all the way back here? Brand was horrified, thinking of that sweet girl wrestling a man their size into bed several times a week. He hoped he was wrong, and that Bronc was just guessing. Bronc caught Brand's gaze for a split second, just long enough for Brand to see that Bronc didn't remember a thing about what Shelley had ever done for him. Bronc waved his hand toward Brand from head to toe. "Get dressed. Wasn't it you that said we're due at breakfast?" Brand decided to let this conversation go, but he vowed to keep Shelley safe from his brother from now on. Chapter 9. The cabin door banged shut behind Bronc, sealing Brand and his judgmental leer inside. All that talk about what a failure Bronc was. But who was at the door first? Bronc harumphed and inhaled the cold morning air deep into his lungs. His head cleared as he trudged to the main house, the eastern horizon just beginning to brighten beyond. He barged through the kitchen's back door and was about to tug his boots off when he heard a chair topple in the dining room, followed by a thud and a moan. He rushed in to find Norman on the floor, limbs in an awkward heap. "Signor Norman!" Alfred cried, scrambling from his own dining room chair. Norman groaned again, his arms moving feebly, eyes squinted in pain. Suddenly dead sober, Bronc reached down to cradle Norman's head. "Whoa there! Don't move just yet." He probed the back of Norman's head. No blood. "Easy does it. Let's get you untangled." Catching Alfred's eye, he whispered, "Get Brand, now." Alfred nodded and took off. Ever so gently, Bronc tugged Norman's wisp of a body away from the table. "Can you feel anything, Norman? Fingers? Toes?" Norman's eyes opened, his expression still twisted in pain. "A mite more than I'd like. Give me up, before the missus finds me in such a sorry state." Sure enough, Marie was pounding down the stairs. She ran into the dining room, her hair unraveled over her shoulders, bobby pins sticking up every which way from a partially coiled bun. "Norman!" The rest happened in a blur. Brand helped Bronc heft Norman into a truck. Norman shooed Marie and Rebecca away. Cord, no doubt, already on the harvester, saying it was nothing and he didn't need an entire platoon to taxi him into the hospital. Then Bronc raced to Mercy Hospital in Sacramento, with Brand bookending Norman to keep him upright in the bench seat between them. The nurses admitted Norman immediately, and all of a sudden Bronc was left helpless and useless in the waiting room. He rotated his hat between his legs, round and round. Warmth rolled off Brand, who was sitting to his left. Or was that heat of anxiety coming from only him? He remembered the first time he'd seen Norman in this hospital, all tubes and bandages and smothered in bitter antiseptic smell. Bronc hated hospitals. Doubly so after he'd been dragged across the country to help some old geezer who was now his grandfather. He kept his distance, watching from the hallway that day, never offering to visit Norman for the next 2 months the man spent as an inpatient while undergoing subsequent surgeries. Even when Norman had returned home, Bronc stayed away from that sick bed and the man who had uprooted his life. It hadn't been 3 days before a fever spiked, and Norman toppled out of his recliner in the living room. It was the middle of the night. No one else was up or dressed, and the old man was ghostly pale. Bronc rushed him to the hospital. There was no time to waste. A few hours after mega doses of antibiotics were given, the man began to talk, and Bronc had never been the same. "Your cords, son," Norman said in a raspy voice from his sterile bed. Not a question, but Bronc nodded anyway. "Youngest." Not wanting another inquiry into his pathetic life, Bronc thought to distract. "Shouldn't you rest?" Norman ignored his request and kept talking.
Wildest?
That question took him aback. But what could it hurt to tell the man the truth? Bronc would eventually go back to Wyoming and never see him again. Yeah, I could say that. Norman turned his head slightly more in his direction. He looked weak and flushed from fever, but it didn't stop him from prying.
Why?
Bronc wanted to snap at him, but the man was incapacitated, so he softened his tone. Why what?
Why are you wild? Out of control?
Bronc's eyes skipped past him and onto the stark wall behind his back. How do you know about this?
Got a daughter who lives in the same house as you, remember?
Bronc sneered. Oh, yeah, he remembered.
Why?
Norman was relentless. We back to that? Why am I wild? He scoffed. I got lots of reasons. But you don't need to hear them, old man. You should rest.
I can rest when I'm dead. Think back. How long have you been wild?
Bronc snorted. My whole life. He still remembered climbing a ladder when he couldn't have been more than 3. Thankfully, Stogie had snatched him off it. That had only been the beginning of a long trail of risky stunts and even poor judgment. The only one who came close to his unruliness was his brother, Clay, who made a living jumping into forest fires.
The ladies like you?
Bronc swung his eyes back to Norman's. He wanted to tell him it was none of his business, but decided to gloat instead. They love me. He grinned then, showing Norman his famous Cooper smile with all his perfect white teeth. Norman tried to laugh, but no sound emerged.
Kind of full of yourself, ain't you, kid?
What's it to you? The old man licked his dry lips and pinned his eyes on Bronc's in a way that made him feel violated. But for some reason he couldn't look away.
Listen up, Sonny. I've lived a long life, learned a lot in my time. The one thing I'm going to pass on to you, and you better listen up because it's the most important thing to get right in life, is how to be the man God wants you to be.
Bronc wanted to stomp out, but couldn't pull his eyes away, let alone get his feet to move. He found himself nodding for him to continue instead.
God is our creator. Whether you believe that or not doesn't change the fact that he is. If that's the case, and it is, don't you think the wise thing to do would be learn about your creator? Read his manual to find out how he wants you to live? And do your best to live that way. Ultimately, learn how to be redeemed.
Norman's voice cracked at the end.
Water, please.
Bronc did a double take, wondering how that fit into the conversation, until he realized what Norman was asking for. He reached for the small glass with a straw on an end table and held it for Norman to take a few sips, then set it down, restless for Norman to speak again. He didn't know why he wanted to hear his wisdom rolling off this man's tongue, but he was suddenly compelled to hear the rest.
The manual is the Bible, son. The Bible, God's Word.
Why Bronc felt perplexed he couldn't say. It made sense that the Bible could be called a manual for humankind to learn how to live. He'd always just thought of it as a history book of sorts, that your grandma kept on her coffee table, something you revered but didn't dare touch.
Do you understand, son?
It's not for me.
Why not?
I'm not redeemable.
Everyone is redeemable. But God gives us a choice. Choose Him or don't. If you choose Him, you spend eternity with Him. If you don't, you are hell-bound. A real place where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. Sounds pretty specific, don't it? Whether you believe that or not, it doesn't change the fact that it exists. It's kind of like gravity. You may be stubborn and say you don't believe in it, but try stepping off the top of a silo and see what happens. There's no denying it.
Bronc tried to take in the words Norman was saying. Didn't figure they could be correct, yet something stirred within him. Something that told him these words were true. Whenever Rebecca had talked about God, he'd just tune her out. But Norman, well, it was like his ears had been uncorked. He couldn't stop listening.
I guarantee life will treat you better if you pick up God's Word every day and read a passage or two. He gives you examples of other sinners to relate to. If you think you're the only one who thinks he's not redeemable, you should get a kick out of the men in the Bible. Try King David on for size. He failed miserably, yet God called him a man after his own heart. If you call on God to help, He picks you up, puts you on the high path, guides you along. Sometimes He carries you when your own legs don't work. He's a good father, Bronc. No matter if you think your own earthly father failed you, your heavenly Father never will.
How did Norman know how he felt about his father? Bronc dropped his head into his hands. "How's he doing?" a female voice said. Bronc brought his head up to see a cute little blonde nurse standing a few feet away. "He's fine. He's been jabbering on," and Bronc swung his head back to smirk at Norman, but stopped short. The man was sound asleep, drool spilling down the side of his mouth. Bronc almost choked on his own spit. Norman looked as if he'd been asleep a long time. The nurse smiled, a sympathetic smile. "I'm sure that's just wishful thinking on your part, and I totally understand. But his vitals don't suggest anything but sleep." She smiled sympathetically, jotted down his vital signs, then left the room. Bronc would never forget that day. He pondered for weeks how Norman could have possibly been talking to him from that hospital bed. It marked the moment he started to love the old man, even if it was steeped in inexplicable mystery. "What do you think happened?" Brand said. Bronc snapped back to the present. "What? When?" "This morning. Why do you think Norman fell?" "Oh, today." For crying out loud, Bronc was losing his mind. Maybe he's done too much lately. Bronc couldn't always keep an eye on him, though he wanted to. But 8 months out from the last surgery, you'd think he'd be stronger. Alfred said his legs just crumpled under him. You heard the pain he was in. Norman had moaned or downright hollered whenever they hit a bump on their way here. He'd done some damage, but what? A man in green scrubs paused in the waiting room door and then approached the two of them. "Are you—" His eyes swept over them, one at a time, then back again. I'm assuming one of you is Bronco? I got a telephone call from Norman's wife. Marie said to refer all information to Bronco." Bronc stood so fast that his hat went sailing across the floor. Brand went after it while Bronc shook the doctor's hand. "That's me. How is he?" "You're his grandson?" Bronc nodded, and Brand did too while he handed Bronc his hat. Grandson. Yes. Didn't matter that they were only related through his dad's second marriage. The doctor shook his head, then looked down. Bronc's stomach sank. When he looked back up, The sympathy in his eyes sent a shockwave of fear through Bronc. What? What is it, Doc? It was a miracle that Norman survived that fall onto those harrow blades. Even more that he still has his leg. God saw fit to keep him on this earth. But we ran a CBC, and his lymphocyte count is very high. Infection? Bronc said. The doctor shook his head. The numbers, they're too high for that. I did a bone marrow aspiration to confirm my suspicion. He has leukemia. Bronc collapsed back into his chair, deboned. The leukemia finally progressed enough for him to spike that high white blood count today. I'm convinced it is responsible for all the ups and downs in Norman's progress these last few months. And I'm certain it caused the weakness in his legs and his fall this morning. We did x-rays. Thankfully, he didn't break anything. Is it curable? Brand asked, clearly knowing Bronc would have if he wasn't in shock. Sometimes, yes. Not always at his age. But he may have an advantage. Chronic inflammation from the trauma of nearly severing his leg may be playing a role here. That carries a better prognosis than if he'd had leukemia brewing before the accident, and we just didn't know it. Bronc had seen the grizzled scar on Norman's thigh and calf. He knew how hard Norman had fought to save the leg, but he gathered his courage to ask the unthinkable. Chronic inflammation. So... Bronc steeled himself for the blow. Would amputation get rid of the source of inflammation? The doctor's gaze flitted to Bronc with a brief look of surprise. Then he pressed his lips together grimly. Norman's too debilitated now, and the leukemia has already spread. Leukemia is a cancer of blood cells. It goes wherever blood goes, which is everywhere. But we can still treat it and hope to achieve remission. How? Brand asked. We can start him on chemotherapy. The good news is, up until now, leukemia has been treated with single-agent chemotherapy only, which didn't give people much hope. Now, a multi-agent protocol has become available. We can start Norman on this more successful chemotherapy right away. A lot depends on Norman's immune system, and as you know, his body has been through a lot. How... what... Bronc couldn't quite spit it out. Brand seemed to know what he wanted to ask. No surprise there. I've heard the word, but what exactly is chemotherapy? The doctor pivoted to better face both twins. It's a cocktail of chemicals that kill fast-growing cells in the body, which are the harmful cells, cancer cells. Oh, both brothers said together. Norman is asleep right now. When he wakes up, we can determine the best treatment plan and set a time to begin. You can wait here or at his bedside. With him, Bronc blurted. Please. They followed the doctor to Norman's hospital bed in the medical wing. The rest of the morning seemed to drag on. Norman finally awoke, looking much better. Bronc smiled meekly at him. Doc will explain everything to you. Then we can take you home. Norman smiled back and nodded. After calling the doctor back in, the next half hour was grueling. Bronc's throat tightened with every blank look Norman gave him. As soon as the doc finished, Norman asked, What are the chances the chemo, will kill the leukemia? I can't give you a specific number, but we're hopeful. What kind of side effects are there? Well, the doctor cleared his throat. There's quite a list. Nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, dizziness, hair loss. I'm sure you get the idea. Chemo targets fast-growing cells, which also happen to include the normal cells that grow your hair and line your gut,
So, you can't guarantee the results, but you do know the toe-curling side effects. Well, thank you, Dr. James, for the details, but I'll skip it.
What? Bronc shot out of the chair, knocking it back against the wall. You have to try it, old man.
Come here, son.
Norman always called him that, and he took it to heart. Norman was like a father to him, more so than his own father. Bronc ambled over while Brand looked on. Norm took one of his hands and squeezed it, then let it go.
I've suffered enough with this injury. I'm sure there are natural remedies I'll be willing to try, but I'm not willing to puke my brains out on top of everything else. You understand?
Not a question, a statement. And who was Bronc to decide otherwise for this incredible man? No one, that's who. He swallowed hard, then nodded. Come on. His throat was so thick it was painful when the words emerged. Let's get you home to Marie. Maybe she could talk some sense into him. Thank you, Doctor, Brand said, shaking the man's hand. Bronc couldn't bring himself to follow suit. He much preferred socking the doctor in the nose. Bronc busied his hands instead by helping Norman get dressed, and counted it a win. Chapter 10. Shelley raced to the hospital as soon as Alfred told her about Norman's fall, but for all her hurry, she got stuck behind a hay truck on a 5-mile section of dirt road, then hit Sacramento morning traffic. When she finally squealed into the hospital parking lot, she was seeing red. She pulled in a deep breath and held it together long enough to cajole the right room number out of the admission nurse. Then she barreled down the hallway to the correct door, only to run into Brand, who was suddenly pushing her back out. She tried to squirm free, catching a glimpse of Norman and Bronc. Bronc looked deathly pale. Wait!
Brand gripped her arms and gently pushed her the rest of the way into the hall.
Come on, Shelley. Let's wait out here. How's Norman? Norman's getting dressed to come home. Bronc is helping him. Is Norman going to be okay? Brand put a hand to her lower back and guided her to one of the folding chairs next to the door. It's good of you to come, but why did you come? She swiveled around, nearly tripping him in the process. Well, what do you mean? To see how Norman is, of course. You should have waited at the ranch. You know we would have filled you in when we got back. She heaved a sigh. Fine. I came for Bronc. He worries so over Norman. And you know how he's been drinking. He doesn't need any more reason to do that. She peered up at Brand. It was so unnerving. How in the world could this brother be identical, yet she felt nothing for him? Not even the slightest double heartbeat. He was only a duplicate outer shell of the man she'd already fallen hard for, long ago. Brand's brows knitted together. I know you came all this way, but you should go now. We'll handle getting Norman back home. No! She stood on tippy-toes to get closer to his face. I'm staying. Brand backed a step, then took in her wild ponytail and mud-spattered boots. She shifted her weight, but there was no hiding the boots. What was she thinking, showing up at a hospital dressed so grubby? She tucked the loose strands of her hair behind her ears, self-consciously. Why stay? Brand asked. Bronc's going to need me, that's why. Who do you think has been taking care of him all this time? Your father? Norman? Rebecca? No. Me. She stuck a thumb to her chest to emphasize her point. A nurse rolled a wheelchair up to them, catching their attention. She opened the door and let herself into Norman's room. Shelley followed behind her, seeing Norman dressed and leaning heavily against a ravaged Bronc. Bronc took one look at Shelley and seemed ready to collapse himself. She flew to his side. He'd looked this way before, when he was drunk, but he was as sober as a preacher right now. His hands began to shake even as they held loosely to Norman's frail frame. Soon he'd fall apart and embarrass himself, which would lead to more drinking and more embarrassment. His emotions were a mess lately. She had to do something, quick. Let me take this for you. Shelley bumped the nurse out of the way with a hip, ignoring the put-out look on the young woman's face. Sit down, Norman. Brand can wheel you out and take you on home. Bronc and I have an errand to run, and we'll be right behind you. Both Brand and Bronc raised their brows, identical, confused looks on their attractive faces. Under any other circumstance, she would have laughed. Brand recovered first, understanding more than she'd given him credit for. You got it. Come on, Norman. It'll give us a chance to get to know each other better. Smart man that he was, Norman nodded and sat. Shelley took one of Bronc's hands and pulled him with her down the hall, to the elevator, and on out the hospital doors. They didn't speak until they got to her ranch truck. Bronc opened the passenger door and stepped back, waiting for her to climb inside. She had planned to drive, but could see he needed to. Figuring his emotions had taken all the beating they could for one day, she fumbled in her pocket for the keys and handed them to him. Then she climbed in and sat, expecting him to close the door. But he didn't. He stood, nearly hanging from the door, staring into her eyes as he teared up. Thanks for coming, Shell. His words seemed to logjam. He crumpled, dropping his face to her stomach. He slid both arms between her back and the seat and squeezed. The most excruciatingly mournful sob reverberated into her abdomen, vibrating her whole body. She was flabbergasted. Looking down at his tousled hair, she noticed his dark curls going in all which ways. She'd realized then that he hadn't had time to comb it before rushing to the hospital. Tentatively, she ran her fingers through it, distracting herself with its silky richness as he wept. All she could do was comb her fingertips through his hair, soothing herself and him, and wait. His broad shoulders shuddered with another sob. She'd seen him emotional during his drunken bouts, but never like this, dead sober and utterly undone. He bawled, heaving air in and out as if his life depended on it. She kept stroking, her entire being swept up in Bronc's vulnerability. It was unsettling seeing him like this. Slowly, she realized she'd been humming an old tune, one she hadn't thought of since her childhood Sunday school days. She missed those days of rest. The words came to her, simple and sweet, and she sang them over Bronc like a prayer. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Bronc relaxed into her, then lifted his face and took a deep breath. She kept singing as she used her thumbs to soothe the tears off his whiskered, roughened cheeks and chin. His beautiful eyes swirled their autumn colors through two glistening pools of grief. Ah, Buster, what is it? His mouth lifted ever so slightly at the corners. You haven't called me that in months. His voice was hoarse, like he'd had a shouting match instead of a crying jag. You noticed? Well, sure. I recollect you first named me that when I was busting someone's... Okay, she interrupted, laughing softly. You're the original Bronc Buster. His sad, crooked smile was crushing her heart. She smoothed his hair back, rubbed the last of the moisture off his rugged face. "You okay enough to tell me what's happening?" His small smile vanished, and his eyes refilled. She hoped he could say what he had to say before he lost control all over again. "We got bad news." He swallowed hard and pinched his lips together. Her heart skidded forward. What in the world was Norman having to face now? "Go on." "Norman, he has..." He dropped his forehead onto hers. She rubbed the back of his neck. He'd never been like this with her. But holding him like this, touching him like this, had her own emotions in turmoil. "Is it his leg?" He sniffed once, then lifted his head to look at her. They were only inches apart. He closed his eyes in a grimace of pain. "Norman has leukemia, Shell. Leukemia. I can't lose him. I can't." His voice broke on the last word. "No, no." Shelley grasped his face with both hands and looked deeply into his grief-stricken eyes. Long seconds passed before she finally pressed her forehead back to his. They breathed each other's air, letting out a sob now and then, letting the tears slide down their faces in unison. "He's like a..." He choked on the words. "Like a father to me. I need him." "Yes, Buster. We all need him. We will fight with him, whatever it takes." Bronc raised his head again, this time studying her eyes. The poor man didn't need many people, but she knew how much he needed Norman. And her, even if he didn't recognize that last one. He took a deep breath. "The doctor says there's a new chemotherapy. They're seeing better success with it. But Norman said no." She sucked in a breath. That made no sense. Norman had fought tooth and nail to survive this far. She shook her head in disbelief. Bronc wrapped his arms around her again, and they held each other in exhausted silence until Bronc finally leaned back and said, "My knees are asleep." She looked down at his weird angle and grinned, grateful for the levity. "You do look like a pretzel." Bronc winced a little as he straightened one leg, then the other. "We should go." He looked stronger. Good. But she knew Norman's refusal to pursue treatment was still ringing in his ears, same as hers.
Hi, my name is Dannul Dailey. I'm the narrator and producer for Janith Hooper's Let Your Lives Begin Again, her latest book in the Cooper family saga. We've taken the time to break this one up into 4 parts, mainly due to the length of the story, and we hope that you enjoy it. Each part will come out, relatively soon after the preceding chapter. Be sure to tune in to the next part of Let Your Lives Begin Again. Find out how Bronc handles Norm's news, then see what's coming next. Available in a few short weeks. And as always, we encourage you to subscribe below, and please leave a comment. Let us know what you think about the story and the narration. Happy holidays, and thank you.